And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room already tonight. Of course, tonight I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, I hear that in this rainy, soaked Harvard Square night, there's cause for hope. You know why?
Oh, why is that?
Some of your very favorites are coming to Harvard to teach.
Okay, and they are?
Including Mayor Lori Lightfoot from Chicago, that incredible New World Order mayor. And Jacinda Ardern.
Yeah, it's an incredible
fantastic
reward.
leader of New Zealand. Whew. And they're going to teach WEF wisdom. This is nice. Unbelievable. Yes, even though I'm doing it in a joking fashion, that is actually true. Their reward.
Just to think, I mean, I don't even know what I would do if I passed them, you know? I don't know if I could keep my mouth shut.
This is the tough thing. You know, you do your regular work, the good stuff to wake people up, and you're walking around in the same city with the likes of Lightfoot and Ardern. But Harvard, you know, they take care of the WEFers, and the centralizers get their jobs, and they're very distinguished after the fact, but we know the real deal. Tonight, we're going to go seriously into NASA, and this is going to be fascinating. Of course, NASA had the big conference and presentation, public presentation about their UFO findings. And I thought a couple of interesting things came out of that accidentally on their part. One of them is, of course, they debunked all of the TTSA videos, especially the go fast, hilariously going a massive 40 miles an hour. It turns out that's pretty not fast. But it was very interesting because 3 years ago, I brought Russell Targ on this program and we talked about it. And he had said that none of the stuff that they showed in the radar footage for the Tic Tac and all that was doing anything that they had claimed. And there were a number of independent professionals who had come to that conclusion, but the media ran with it, and the CIA was behind that one. We're going to get into why they pushed that then and why NASA, so solidly debunked it, and also the mystery around NASA. How did NASA get started, after all? Where you're going to have to go back into the Eisenhower JFK era for that, but then you're going to find yourself far before that with something called NACA, which came largely out of an occult group. Isn't that fun? So Aleister Crowley and our friend Jack Parsons make an appearance here tonight in this special report, which is basically a setup for our IGY International Geophysical Year UFO special that's coming up a little later in June. This one will give you all the train tracks on the side. So it's NASA X Occult UFO File Mystery. I want to remind you, before we get started, that we're going to take your questions in the second half of tonight's program. And you can ask those questions now for Miss Olivia. She's putting those together before we get any further along tonight. Miss Olivia, how are we doing out there?
Good. Nathan Coldis says, Stepford Biden not doing too well with the walking.
This is terrible stuff. And, it does. It feels like elder abuse at that point. And they're going to have to do something with Biden. And, at the end of the day, they've had a lot of fun rolling him out there, have him stumbling around, and he can't remember where he is. But this is the leader of the free world. Think about it. This is not good for America or its image. And, this is the nature of the Democrats. As long as they can get their policies done, they'll roll anybody, any corpse past the goal line and shove them in the White House. But, I think it's very disturbing footage. No question about it. What else you got?
Alex Leggett said, that picture of Lamb in the thumbnail freaks me out every time I see it. Crowley drawing that is disturbing.
Lamb's very important because this is an entity that contacted Crowley, and Crowley was in one of these very deep rituals that he did. Crowley had learned the cream of the crop of doing rituals during his period inside the Golden Dawn, which ties directly into a steganography here on this show, because you all know the story of Johannes Trithemius if you watch the show. And he was the one who came forward in the 15th century giving us these hints. So I think it's actually 1502, so technically the 16th century. But here he was this very unusual abbot, and an abbot at 21, which I checked with Joseph Farrell on that. It's very unusual, even in that time and day. And they must have known he had this unusual propensity for calling in the spirits, as it were. But he found he was so good at it that he was worried about the nature of the rituals and the things he was doing, a la John Dee, of conjuring up these angels. So he decided that he wanted to get a manuscript out about it to these other churches for the people he knew he could trust. But for the general people, he thought, if this falls into the wrong hands, forget it. And, I'll be burnt at the stake. So he recreated steganography, which had come down to us from the Egyptians and the Atlanteans. And he referred back to a period of the Greeks using steganography, calling it a page within a page, that when you look at one thing, you're seeing another. And only an initiate would know. And again, steganography, a little bit different than cryptography, because with cryptography, very often you're trying to solve a puzzle. Steganography is something everyone can see and that is out there, but only an initiate understands exactly what it means. So Trithemius would keep these rituals and these scrolls and use a certain system of spells and steganography with them. And he hid them. And years later, I'm going to draw this kind of connect the dots line all the way from that experience in the 16th century to Marshall Mathers and Golden Dawn, crisscrossing with those scrolls, starting the Golden Dawn. And then we get Crowley, and then out of Crowley comes Parsons, NASA, and then the UFO phase. So this is going to be quite a trajectory. We're going to do a special report here tonight, a couple hours with you. And like I said, in the last 40 minutes or so, we'll take your questions. And I also want to remind you, if you're new here, especially, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter, which keeps us in touch with each other, regardless of the intense censorship that we see going on, even on Twitter now, which is supposed to be liberated by Elon Musk, if you believe that. And there has been some changes there for sure. What's interesting, though, is we've been seeing a lot of things getting banned over there now. And interestingly enough, today, YouTube conjured up a new policy, and they say, well, you can actually talk about election fraud now. We're not going to pull your channel down for doing that. That's a new policy. Figure that one out. What if they got planned? We're going to see. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is an X series special report. It's NASA X, the occult side here of NASA, the UFO File mystery with Aleister Crowley, Jack Parsons, and all the gang, von Braun, and the rest. But how does that lead us to Musk and, of course, the UFO File trotted out this week by NASA, debunking their friends at TTSA and the clown Elizondo and the intelligence group that came out pushing that? This is all going to come together in one huge piece tonight. It's great to have so many of you here with us. I'm going to start off with a couple of things. Now, you might be sort of recalling that I've been suggesting in the 2024 presidential campaign there's going to be a major role for the UFO File. And a lot of people would think, it's controversial, leave it alone if you're a presidential candidate. My advice is exactly the opposite. Get ahead of this thing, because they're planning something big, most likely a false disclosure coming out of the CIA aspect, the thing that they've been pushing and had so many problems with. Well, there's a direct correlation and representation of the UFO File through the Trump candidacy. As we know, Trump's uncle was the recipient of all that wisdom around the UFO File from his mentor, Vannevar Bush, who ran the UFO File. Trump has that piece, has that knowledge. He has that Roy Cohn connection, which connects him to the defense industrial security complex. That whole piece is all UFO related. And you put in some of those Tesla ties and you get more of that. Well, when you move to the Kennedy side, and there's going to be some things about RFK tonight because they're attacking his candidacy heavily, because he's calling out so much of the censorship and so much also of the pharmaceutical treachery, the COVID op, and so on. But I do feel that there's also a piece now of the UFO File in this, and it's coming through DeSantis. We have to watch this aspect, because the people who are on the UFO disclosure side, in quotes, are pushing hard from Rubio, and he's the senator from Florida who ran for president famously in 2016, and also through Ron DeSantis. The DeSantis thing is coming through loud and clear, and it's coming through the figure of Robert Bigelow. which I also find interesting. And Bigelow, we have to think of him in a much larger sense. He is someone who runs Bigelow Aerospace. The idea was to have all these hotels in space, as he's a massive hotel guy and a billionaire. But he was also on Harry Reid's payroll. And the whole thing about ATIP and all that stuff came directly from Harry Reid doing favors for his friends. Other people on his payroll include consultants like George Knapp, for example. So he's deep in the UFO piece. A Las Vegas hotel mogul who ardently believes in UFOs. That's a good one. How do you ardently believe in UFOs? Tell me that one.
Says I guess because you know something, right?
Exactly. Says I'm sure he does ardently believe in UFOs. I'm not even disagreeing. Funneling millions into Ron DeSantis's super PAC. I will give him more money and go without food. He's going to go without food for this guy. Now, isn't that an interesting statement? Why is he willing to put every cent of his billions into Ron DeSantis? Well, knowing the extent of his interest in the UFO file, and he's the guy who went on 60 Minutes and said aliens are right under our nose, then this is someone who wants to give their fortune to DeSantis. What does he know that DeSantis is going to do? Well, in all of my perusing of all the statements that DeSantis has made, I haven't found anything about UFOs, phony UAP, or anything like that. So something is going on there, maybe in relation directly to the fact that he's there on the Space Coast and they're planning something. Bigelow says aliens right under people's noses. Space entrepreneur Robert Bigelow raises eyebrows. Public interest when he made a provocative statement on the CBS News program 60 Minutes. And that goes all the way back to 2018. Bigelow told correspondent Lara Logan that aliens are already here on Earth, right under people's noses. Since the program aired, UFO Curious, they do that with the hash. It's like /curious. Is that what? Buy UFO Curious? Is that the idea? Folks around the world have wondered what Bigelow meant with that controversial statement during our recent sit-down, blah, blah, blah. But it is interesting. This is what we're getting into and what I've been sort of warning everyone on the political side about, which is you're going to see the UFO file in the middle of the 2024 campaign. Those candidates who are on top of it at least appear to be ready to release information about it, talk openly about it, are going to fare very well. Because what's going to happen is it's going to be out there. They're going to pull this thing. And then the people who've been talking about it and have some good information and good intel in the background about what they can say are going to fare extremely well. Now, the NASA presentation didn't set off any real alarm bells because they basically said, well, we really can't see because we don't have the money because of the sensors. But actually it wasn't true. They've had years and years and years of public funding. They've developed a gigantic space infrastructure. So this whole thing is a joke. They have not only that, they have, since they started, all of the satellite photography of UFOs around the planet, entering the planet, leaving the planet, going to the moon, etc. So here we are right in the middle of all that. Debates erupt after NASA UAP panel debunks Go Fast and Water UFO videos. Now, this is actually the big takeaway from this panel getting together. That story is a big one, and I'll tell you why. Because it was the likes of the TTSA and the likes of the CIA and Jim Semivan and the media and all this stuff who were touting these videos, and the videos were fake. They were made inside the government because the government doesn't want to show you what they actually have. But they were able to scam these out and make them seem like, oh, they're classified, and Lou Elizondo leaked them to Chris Mellon, both on the CIA payroll. Now, what's interesting is they've had the rule of the roost in the media on that for 5 years, even though now they're exposed. Now they're exposed at this level, on the NASA level, not on the independent media level. Their own people who would be supporting and propping up the op aren't doing it. They've had enough of the bungling op. So what does that mean? Well, I want us to understand that in the game of the UFO file disclosure, you've got different degrees and different names for those degrees. But one of them that you have to pay attention to is obsters. So it's people who are in the op to play their part. And so the opsters in this case.
Are you coining this term?
I am coining the term.
I
yes.
love it.
Well, the thing is, we have a lot of opsters right now, and you've got some serious ones. Elizondo being one of the main opsters. Corbell is an opster. They're all in there running their part of the op for their own personal profit. Now, the ex-players are totally different. They're way above, and they play off the opsters against each other because they want a certain type of results. The ex-players, are the biggest and, let me tell you, the most hardcore. So people that we've got out there going all the way back, I've pointed out people on this level, Lloyd Berkner, for example, and his presence on the Robertson panel in the 50s. That is what we're talking about. It is seriously, a totally hardcore group. So those, and then we have, of course, the Bobo, which you can't miss the Bobo. The Bobo is, Tom DeLonge is the perfect thing in the Bobo. And what you have inside that structure of intelligence is when something goes wrong, they have built up a Bobo. So if they need to cut the op and run in the other direction, they have someone there holding the bag. And so that's what they did with guys like him. But first, they make a big noise out of it. They pump $50 million into the op and so on. So it all depends. But you're going to see all along the way here through the 2024 election that opsters, the opsters part is going to grow, and the ex-players are going to be more and more hidden. We're not going to be able to tell who's running the opsters. So we're going to have to track back through the opsters to figure out who's running this stuff. But it's going to get crazier. And so my big advice as far as the Bobby Kennedy campaign, the Trump campaign, is to get into that fight early, because DeSantis with all the Bigelow money is a major sign. If this guy's going to put every cent of his fortune in, watch out. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist special report, going deep here tonight with you on this NASA X Occult UFO File mystery. Well, why is it NASA Occult? Believe it or not, I'm going to tell you in great detail. We've done some shows on Crowley and the Golden Dawn, and we've done some shows also on Jack Parsons, but this is going to just bring the foundation together, since NASA's been covering the UFO thing, and it's going to bring everything up to date as well. Before we go any further, I did want to make mention that there were a couple of stories that caught my eye this week. One of them was the fact that Bill Gates had got his hands on nuclear technology. That's kind of a problem when you think about it. It's a little bit of a problem. Now, Gates has been running around the world saying, I'm going to save the world with all these vaccines. And he was the one who was saying, oh, people will never be able to shake hands again. Remember that? And he said, well, maybe we could go back to normal in 2 or 3 years if everybody does everything we say and takes all these vaccines. Well, now he's back, baby. And he's not interested in vaccines. He's interested in nukes. So now Bill Gates is setting off his own nukes to help climate change with his company, Terra Power. Terra. Even former State Department officials are telling him to stop the dangerous tests. This is interesting. Now, former officials who are in the non-proliferation business and have been for years know that loose nukes are a bad idea. And his whole thing is, I want to set off nuclear bomb set uranium in Kansas or wherever he's doing this. And that way we'll get a climate change solution that will be energy sufficient and all the rest. Well, this is interesting to me because, what they're saying in the article is, groups of terrorists could get their hands on this and set off an explosion. So it's just too perfect. The idea that they would even let this guy do this with his company is outrageous. I know he has tremendous financial sway, but, I think we're in a little bit of a situation with that where there should be great outrage where he is since that story hit, to make sure that they do not set off nuclear weapons grade uranium tests of any kind. Even the government has stopped doing those tests. So very, very dangerous scenario there as well. And of course, when you have guys like that who are also getting into hologram technology, as we showed back when he was doing that weird Mayan god hologram thing, Gates and his investments is something to watch, especially his farmland purchases here in America. And, there's a lot of buzz in the alternative media about this subject and that subject and all the rest. I do think that one's being missed. It's not being hit on properly. And so I'd like to call more and more attention to the incredible advantage of the farmland that our friend Bill Gates has. Okay. I'm going to talk about some of the obsters in this, and some of it brings me no pleasure because of the nature of the UFO file people involved in this. But I want to draw a few lines connecting dots directly to this NASA presentation, and also from the NASA presentation to what we were talking about with the whole setup. Now, we had a lot of weird things happen around the UFO file. The first thing was that Gary Nolan came out and he said aliens have been on Earth for a long time, but he wasn't doing it for any kind of consortium of education or anything like that. Remember, this is the CIA scientist who's good friends with Fauci and all the rest. And he claims to be an abductee and he knows all this stuff about the UFO file. Well, he's at the SALT conference. And the SALT conference is all about, basically getting people to invest in your venture project. It has nothing to do with UFOs unless you're just looking to thicken up the budget on the UFO side. So it's a very odd thing, shall we say, for him to be there. Now, aliens have been on Earth for a long time, says Nolan. That was the first thing. There was a big hoopla about it. And then I had to point out that during that session, when he was going back and forth with the host, he said, you know what? As it turns out, we used the threat op to get here. So we have been using the UFO threat op in order to get attention on this, so I could be out here talking about it. So for years and years, of course, we've been putting that out there over the past few years, especially, and just that they've been planning and plotting this thing. And so many people around the UFO thing have said, oh, no, everything's fine, hunky-dory. These are great people. The CIA is holding our hands into disclosure. Well, now there he is, someone right in the middle of the whole false disclosure thing, saying we used the threat op. So that's his take on it. And you can hear it. It's in the transcript and the audio of the SALT conference that's up online. So now I remember these guys working together, of course, Knapp and Corbell. And this is interesting to me, too, because what we're looking at with these two is a situation where they were praising CNN as great truth tellers and stuff. I thought that was kind of weird. And all the things that they were coming out with Corbell, being the UFO expert they would go to on CNN, and Knapp really backing him up through some really bad choices. Well, the worst choice came a couple of weeks ago when they both came out with this phony flare situation and said, oh, it's a triangle UFO, when it was quickly debunked. And they said they'd been working on it for a couple of years. It turned out within 20 minutes it had been debunked as soon as that went public. And then they said, oh, well, there's more to come. We're still talking with people about that one. Look, there's the real UFO file. There's tons of it. And there's people with all kinds of video around it. There's people with experiences. The problem is these people keep going to their military contracts. So when they can put out the video and they can do all this stuff and they can have that little copyright thing in the corner. And that's, if ever you see the footage out there, it all says Corbell Inc. or whatever. And, you can't privatize the UFO file. It doesn't work that way. And so that's how they're doing it, though. They selected this guy. He's an obster. They put him in this line. He copyrights all this stuff. They stick that on Fox News, etc. And all the people with regular great footage go out the window, right? So they took this hacks video of flares dropping, and all that had to happen is people researched into where the flares were dropped. At the military field, it happened on the same date. And so that was a complete bogus thing. And so right on top of that, we had the NASA UFO piece. And then the NASA UFO piece debunked the Go Fast video. So we're in an interesting stage where we have the real genuine UFO file. People have genuine experiences. We have a whole history of it in humanity, and especially heavily covered over the last 80 years. That needs to go into a real direction of disclosure. Instead, what we're getting is the CIA sideshow circus and all the obsters working for these false disclosures. That's where you get the phony flares. That's where you get the privatization of the UFO file. That's where you get the phony Go Fast video. So these things are becoming very obvious now, but they were raging, and the press was able to run with the headlines and run away with the UFO file. But it takes a very kind of sane perspective in order to get to the real truth on this, and the real truth is hardcore. And so you have to be kind of, it's not the kind of fluffy pop click stuff that they do on a lot of these channels. So for me, when I look at that, I see that the media tries to see what happens when we run this through the media. What kind of data mining response do we get? So the intelligence groups, the NSA and others, look at all the chatter after the fact of something like this coming out to start to weigh out how deep they can go with that op. How deep can they go? That's going to be the question. And we're going to get to that shortly. I want to remind you, of course, tonight in the second half of the program, we're going to take your questions, and Miss Olivia is going to be putting those together. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
I wanted to say this earlier. Max W. Little said that should be terror power, not terror power.
Terror
it's true.
power.
And I mean, because it is terrifying. Like, let's face it, these are the terrorists. And Gigi Young said about Corbell and Knapp and everything, the grift is unbelievable.
Wow. Think about it. And it's amazing. It's really, the UFO part is in the, the thrall of the grift. And, and Gigi's seen it in the spiritual New Age side too. She sees that the whole thing is active there. And we're seeing on all these sides, how do you get to the real thing? Because of course, it's not to make someone cynical or to make them move
no, we should
away.
Be cynical.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, but I don't want to make people cynical about the subject of UFOs, because far from being something that isn't happening, for example, it's definitely real. It's definitely happening. It's just these people who have hoarded the information for at least 8 decades. That's at least. They're the ones who now need to roll out this technology that they've been building in space with your money. So this is part of the problem too. And how do you do that without giving people some kind of an op? You can't tell them, well, we found this technology, we've been working with it, we split off from humanity, we did this stuff, we broke away over here, developed our own society, and now we're breaking back in with the technology, but you don't know anything about it, we're just going to lay it on you. So we find ourselves, let's say, in an unusual position in relation to all this. A little more on NASA. The person who debunked the Go Fast video, and he did the right thing, which is he used trigonometry to see where the thing was, and said that they had exaggerated through parallax effects the original one, which is exactly what Russell Targ told me 3 years ago in relation to this. So some people who just had an eye for it knew. The water-based UAP, this is interesting, wasn't the only debunked UAP presented during the panel. Joshua Semeter, director of the Center for Space Physics at Boston University, spent time debunking the infamous Go Fast Pentagon video too. So that was the expert that they called in to do that one. In this case, the whole trajectory of those videos, how they came out, the phony thing with Elizondo pretending to defect from the government, Leslie Kean, the niece of Governor Thomas Kean in New Jersey, who had headed up the 9/11 Commission. A lot of dicey political stuff there. She had come forward to vouch for him. Then there was another player, another obster in the middle of all this, and he sort of has slid out of the picture, but I want to call attention to him because recently he's been criticizing the Bobby Kennedy campaign, and I find this interesting. This is a guy, Brian Bender from Politico originally. He left Politico and now he's with a PR firm, Washington PR firm. But this guy was kind of their go-to guy for getting stories out on the national security side. And it's interesting to me because what was going on for our friend Bender is he was the one who vouched for the original New York Times story so that the New York Times could say, aha, we have this other source over here. So Bender then got on these shows like the, I think, Unexplained show, whatever they called the Elizondo show. I even forget the name of it. It was so horrible. But so they had him on there and he was pumping these guys up. Now, the only thing I found strange about this, and I do think it's worthy to look at some of the obsters and where they link back to, because then you get a hint. I had my own interactions with this guy, which already let me know where he was coming from. I knew the group that he was working with. But when you see, when you track them back and you realize the intel people trying to sway things, then you're like, why are the intel people trying to move certain themes out there? So when they had this show out, we have to remember also, because the Masonic side is going to come up tonight, because there were a lot of Masonic people involved with, a lot of Masons involved with the false UFO disclosure push by DeLong, including DeLong himself. That's interesting because way back in the UFO file, they used Vannevar Bush and his ironclad secrecy that he learned as a master Mason to inculcate that environment into the UFO file. So when you see that whole wave come back, and it's nothing against Masons, I'm just laying it out there that these are well-known traits inside certain groups. Then we start to see some of these linkages. In the beginning, remember, this was a Podesta op for Hillary Clinton. And out there was DeLong the Bobo, and they had recruited some writers like Lavenda and stuff. But they could have, they basically wanted to get good writers working with them. And at the time, I don't think people really even knew a lot about what they were doing. But what's interesting to me is what happened with this group is this thing expanded. And so Bender was the person who was vouching for it. And they were like, a lot of people were like, well, he was a foreign policy writer. Maybe, they must have something legit going on. But what was interesting to me is when I went into his career, I found him bashing the Kennedys back there and instead of blaming the CIA for assassinating the Kennedys, he was setting up the this whole anti-hero stance of the Kennedys trying to kill Castro and all this type of stuff as a way to block any attention around the file. So instead of saying, the CIA should release the files of killing President Kennedy, he was saying, it's too bad that Bobby Kennedy had Castro killed and this kind of stuff. So, raising that whole piece. Now, interestingly enough, remember, this is Bender who's associated with TTSA. Like, what's he even doing on the Kennedy stuff? But here he is, little doubts or even operatives linked to CIA covert ops weren't involved in JFK's murder. It's unfortunate that Robert Kennedy Jr. doesn't make the distinction between official sanction and blowback from the dark underbelly of the Cold War spy world. This is the new theme from the CIA, that it was not officially sanctioned that we killed Kennedy. It was just the blowback from the dark underbelly of the cold spy world. Now, for me, this kind of stuff is the stuff you watch, because when people cross over from these camps, when you have the same people working for false UFO disclosure on one hand and also trying to bash the Kennedys in the back, that's the CIA out there running both sides of the street. And for me, that says a lot. And I always said with Bender that there was something very odd about his presence in the middle of that op. It didn't look like his beat. And, they had promised him, hey, get along with this and it'll go somewhere. And they put him on these TV shows and stuff. I don't know anything about Bender except that he's deep in the whole foreign policy reporting business. He's in the PR business now. He got out of Politico. But there he is right in the middle of that. This piece with Musk and the X-Corp, we're going to address this more as time goes. But one thing I want you to keep in mind is the first person that Musk decided to have on a presidential footing for his spaces was Ron DeSantis, without any warning, without anything. And he's invited now Robert Kennedy Jr. on, since Instagram has banned Robert Kennedy Jr. And Musk stepped in and said, hey, want to do a spaces. So that's supposedly coming up on Monday. I'm looking forward to it. But let's remember this with Musk in terms of where his loyalties lie on this. He's the one who had Ron DeSantis there announcing his presidential campaign, which, unfortunately for DeSantis, who is somebody who had some good policies in Florida, he's now become a puppet of the Jeb Bush money machine down there. And their whole thing is take Trump out no matter what, we don't care what the cost is, just get him out of the front running. And they have reasons beyond policy differences to get Trump out of that position, because Trump is on that level with them on the UFO file. That's a problem, big problem for them, much bigger than his position on China or something like that. They have a lot of problems with him, but that one I think is really setting off some firecrackers in the background. Okay. And that's another thing of Bender writing. This is back in 2014. If you go back, answers sought in CIA role in JFK probe. So this is somebody who was on the JFK story early, and they recruited him into the, TTSA, New York Times, BS, UAP op. He was also the one who wrote for Politico how Harry Reid, a terrorist interrogator, and the singer from Blink-182 took UFOs mainstream. This was the vibe that they were putting out there, like, hey, we've got disclosure through these guys. Yeah, it's not a CIA op. But when we look at opsters in the middle of all this, we have to kind of keep track of where they're coming from, because the ex-players on top who control the real big narrative are the ones that we're looking for, and maybe in some cases the opsters can lead us to them. Okay. The last sort of oddness around this before I get into the Crowley NASA part is I couldn't help but notice this weird story about, in a simulation that was going on, an AI drone killing the pilot. And now
this really happened?
Well, it happened in a simulation. So they were doing a simulation, and in the simulation he kills the pilot. Now he wasn't supposed to. He's like,
it's like an episode of Star Trek.
It is, exactly. Air Force said AI drone killed its human operator in a simulation. It's a story that hit. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the AI part here. Everyone knows that there are dangers involved with this. So them moving on the level that they're moving with it shouldn't be happening. The only problem is the technology that they're using now, they developed 35 years ago. So they know the risks, and they've put them through the trials and everything else. They're rolling this stuff out for us 3 decades later as kind of a, so some people can come forward and say like, oh, that AI, we got to watch that AI. It's dangerous. And it is. I agree with those things. Don't get me wrong. But those people on the inside already know it. And they already know that people need to come forward and say this, etc. So, we're looking at an interesting situation there, because what is it that's going on? They already know the risks involved, and they're pushing it full speed anyway. So when they come out hand-wringing like, oh, how bad is it? Our society, I guess, is shrunk to a level where we need robots to control everything. Oh, let's have a session of hand-wringing about that. Artificial intelligence is here to stay, but it may require a bit more command oversight. Hey. An artificial intelligence piloted drone turned on its human operator during a simulated mission, according to a dispatch in the 2023 Royal Aeronautical Society Summit, attended by leaders from a variety of Western air forces. It killed the operator because the person was keeping it from accomplishing its objectives. Yeah, how about that? Well, gee, isn't the person supposed to be in charge? Air Force Colonel Tucker Cinco Hamilton, the chief of the AI test of operations, said at the conference that basically what had happened was it was the human interference that caused it, not AI. Now, like a lot of things, we have to remember this. We're so far behind what the breakaways have and what the secret space program is about and where the technology levels are, that we have to really imagine and wrap our heads around the fact that the problems that are coming forward as a result, and that they're doing this moralizing over, are completely artificial. And we have to somehow leap ahead and see through them to the technology they actually possess, which is why when they come up with phony ops about, hey, here's a UFO video and the government leaked it through a classified thing, and somehow the guy who leaked this classified video, nothing happened to him. We have to be a little wiser on the surface, because now these stories have run around and people are seeing the wrong things, and that's really the media's fault. But on the independent side, we can make up for that gap by really giving people the deep information, which is the UFO file part is extremely real, but the op around it is heavy, and there's a lot of money moving in the background. There's a lot of influence, and there's a lot of advent of new technology that they need to roll out, which is why they're getting, these senators and Congress people to flip out over UFOs and like, oh my God, that government needs to give us disclosure, when we've never heard of them doing anything around UFOs until last year or the year before. I mean, this is it. What kind of history is that? There's a guy, of course, a congressman in Arizona right now, Ruben Galejo, who's, this guy's running for Senate against Kristen Sinema. And, he's one of those big UFO ops guy. Well, the only problem with him is that he was over here at Harvard doing psychological operations. That's his expertise. So what's he doing waving this UFO banner and running for senator? What are they up to? What are all these Congress people who are talking about UFOs up to? This becomes important. And I think NASA got itself in the middle of this because there's a tug of war around the UFO file going on around the Space Force, which was Trump's attempt to put it under executive control. NASA, which has their own deep history on this, with Paperclip basically having the biggest role of the Paperclip scientists in setting it up. But it has the original mandate from President Kennedy, which is peace in space. Well, nobody wants that anymore. And then you have the people who are holding that Exprotect knowledge of the UFO file deep in the corporate intelligence aerospace crisscross in that corridor, in that defense contractor corridor. So that's a huge push pullback. And what you saw this week, interestingly enough, was NASA wanting to swat back at the false op. And the person that they used to do it was Sean Kirkpatrick. And he's a whole interesting piece in himself. But as this plays out, we're going to see more and more interesting things along this line. And everyone is going to be saying, oh, we need more and more resources. The AARO group needs more resources. And what you can get away with for a little while in acclimating the public to shooting down UFOs, as they already started to do in February, you can acclimate the public to be shooting down these UAP discs, right? They're not even UFOs. And you can set up all kinds of influence and technology to roll out and finances as a result of that piece as well. That's the original initial step. The threat thing is what you build up to. And this is what we're in the middle of seeing them doing, laying the foundation. And the threat piece leads to what? Emergency powers. That's the way it rolls. And interestingly enough, even if they hold the threat and keep, with the environment, if they hold the emergency powers and they say, we're not going to use them until the ultimate moment, they're building that scenario. So just like when they had the 9/11 event and all the things went down around Homeland Security, they built that whole infrastructure, which, by the way, has 250,000 employees now. That's a lot of people. If you get rid of Homeland Security, you probably balance the whole budget. 250,000 people? And what are they doing? What's going on with Homeland Security? We never even had it before the 9/11 event. Think about that. The country got by just fine without it. Well, our air defenses are important. Well, apparently we had to tweak our air defenses just to make sure we saw that Chinese balloon. Are you kidding me? So there's a lot of play acting going on. And the more we expose the play acting, the more they know they're talking to an intelligent audience. And that's what you get here in the Ideas Room, of course. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show deep tonight in the UFO NASA op. So great to have so many of you here with us. This is NASA X Occult UFO Mystery. Crowley, Parsons, and the whole gang are going to be on our radar, and we're going to take your questions in the second half of tonight's program. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia.
Post Atlanta says, so are there ET hybrids among us, and are some of them famous, i.e. famous for social media or tech?
I think there's a real question around things of this nature. And I've had a series of interviews with David Jacobs. I might have him come back on the program, who is completely convinced as a result of 4 decades of work around this. And he's kind of the last of the Mohicans who really has that deep knowledge around the UFO file. And I would say, you know, he was around the whole John Mack, Bud Hopkins, that whole wave of UFO contactee piece, which I think was gigantic. And he's very convinced that. And, you know, he's a professor at Temple University for decades. I mean, this is not a fly-by-night researcher. He's been spending the time on it. And according to him, it's absolutely viable. And he feels that this is something that's happening based on people's experiences. Now, you know, for me, it has to be one of those things where in culture, you know, it's a big thing to swallow, but there can be people in culture who can see things before the general culture lines up to accept it. And so I wouldn't rule it out. What else you got?
Northern Lights said, so what was the NASA press conference about?
Well, it was a panel of experts who had been put together last summer because NASA wanted to get in on the whole UAP sweep because they figured, hey, there's some influence and financing to be had. Before that, they were resolute in, you know, barring people from seeing the real artifacts. Remember, there's a whole program at NASA for getting information obfuscated from the public. So we have a number of people who've come forward and said, well, we worked for NASA and our job was to do what? It was to wipe out the images of these ruins that they found on the moon. Now, what were ruins doing on the moon? So, and that was in the late 60s that they were looking at that. So somebody was already up there doing stuff, or they had been there a long time ago. Take your pick. But whatever it was, you might say the public deserved to see it, especially since, you know, the whole thing was predicated on the idea of one small step for mankind and all this money and all this time and everything else. So instead, they decided we're going to look into that stuff and we'll just tell the public, hey, you know, there might be water on Mars. So that's the level difference. I understand the idea that you could say, well, roll things out slowly. But, you know, it's been how many years since the first moon landing? 1969. You know, I mean, here we are. Was that 55 years later? It's pretty significant to kind of get us up to speed with what they've discovered. But they don't want to do that. What they want to do is take advantage of the fact that they had the last manned moon mission in 1972 and all that infrastructure development in the meantime. You know, the last attempt that we had at a manned program was the shuttle that blew up during Reagan's term. And all these years they've talked about it. Oh, yeah, we're going back to the moon. And nobody ever did it. And then Trump finally said it and they announced it for 2024. And then Biden got in and said, yeah, we're going to do it, but not in 2024. And there's a lot of weird things around that, including the name of the program, Artemis. I'm going to get into that tonight because it gets us into a weird headspace around Sirius, which is where I want us to look for the alien connection in all of this and where they're pointing their antenna, occult and technical to. Sirius becomes very, very important, it turns out. Let's get into some odd clues around that, hanging around in the esoteric literature, and then move full scale into some of the people like Crowley saying this. And then we'll take your questions, and then we'll be done.
Sounds good.
All right, good. I want to remind you, if you're new here, before we go any further, take a second and sign up for our free newsletter. Go to darkjournalist.com. And that newsletter is free, but it lets you know the amazing things that we have coming up for you. And it's very important that we have that pipeline with you because I get a lot of messages from people saying, well, you know, I didn't get notification and, you know, all this other stuff. Well, the best way to handle that situation is to make sure that you're right on the newsletter list. And basically, you'll get a newsletter once a week about the incredible shows we have coming up for you, interviews that are going to blow your mind. That I have not announced yet that are coming up and all kinds of exciting events and documentaries and all the rest of it through the summer. Watch out. And, you know, I want to say this before I go any further because I didn't print it out, but one of these CIA people, one of the obsters who can lead us to the X players is John Ramirez. And Ramirez, in my opinion, is playing this role of they have a bunch of guys out there now who are like, I was in the CIA and I'm a contactee. because what the CIA realized they needed to do, they want to go after that area too, the contactee bit. They want to do it on the second level. They want to get past the UFO thing and go to the contact thing next. And but their problem is all the people that are actual contactees, because of the nature of their experience, it's very hard to spin them one way or another. So what you do is you come up with your own. You've got your own. And if they're agents, then they're under all kinds of national security obligations, and you can have them do whatever you want. You know, they're going to hang upside down from a Christmas tree for you. So Ramirez is one of these guys who, like Semivan, has come out and said, I've had these UFO encounters. Now, when you have a counterintelligence CIA agents coming out and giving you this, saying that they've had experiences, you get into weird territory. There are others also. Now, what they've been doing with him is interesting, because he's been saying, oh, there's a big disclosure thing coming up. And I don't think he's lying, but I don't think it's real disclosure either. But I think it's interesting they're using him with this kind of predictive thing, like, oh, you know, watch out, here comes the disclosure. But on a recent show he was doing, he did a shout out to two of our top guests here on this program. One of them, John Warner the fourth, as we know, the son of Senator Warner, and Joseph Farrell. Joseph, if you're out there tonight, I want you to know that you're in the thoughts of John Ramirez, CIA abductee. And he did a big shout out to both of them. And I thought, isn't this interesting? Because what they realize they need to do is they need to go in and convert somebody somewhere inside these circles. Well, let me tell you something, Ramirez and anyone else is doing this. You know, somebody like Warner, his dad was in MJ12. You know what I mean? Like, how stupid do you think he's going to be? Do you think he's going to jump ship and join your op? It's not going to happen. He's already working against his cousin who's doing false disclosure. Do you think he's going to join you? You know, and Farrell knows the story better than anybody. So I find this whole approach rather distasteful, shall I say. So my message to people on the CIA is, you know, on the CIA disclosure side, who are weaseling into the UFO field in this most extraordinary public fashion, that you're wasting your time with that crew, and you're wasting your time with any of that here. Any of the people who are pulling the op on the CIA side were all welcome on this program to come in and give their side of it, and they all turned down the offer carte blanche, and they blocked me. Okay, that's where they're coming from. They're running scared because they can't take an honest question and answer session because they're afraid. Olivia, what did you say happened with Gary Nolan this week?
I don't remember.
What? He blocked you.
Oh, that's right. I had never engaged with him once.
Think about
on Twitter.
this. So, you know, so this guy who's supposed to be doing this incredible op for the CIA has to block Olivia, you know, on Twitter. Think about it. I mean, he blocked me and I made a funny thing about it. But, you know, the whole thing that I find interesting in all this is where these people are coming from, you know, and that the level of things that they think they can get away with. So as far as shout outs go, that's their shout out. Here's my shout out back. You know, you know, Ramirez, I don't accept that you're a contactee, and I don't accept that your friend Semivan is a contactee. I think you're both CIA agents, top level people, and trying to work the op that you've been trying to work for the past 5 years. So, you know, I don't blame you for doing the op, but don't expect me to, you know, accept it on any level as the truth. Because it's, you know, the idea of all these CIA agents showing up who are suddenly abductees reminds me very much of the little copyright that I see on all the UFO videos that says copyright Corbell. Something wrong with the privatization of the UFO file. And so we're going to call that out. And that's what we're here for, right? We're here to give you the truth. That's what I'm doing. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X Series Special, NASA X Occult UFO File Mystery. John Ramirez, this one's for you. Here we go. Let's go back in time. Do I get back in time music from you? How about a whistle? Okay. Back here around 1875, H.P. Blavatsky, who was a Russian woman who had gone to explore the mystery schools in Tibet and India and Egypt, came over to America and met Henry Olcott. And Olcott was a credentialed, very distinguished general who came out of the Civil War and had participated on basically the Warren Commission of its day, investigating the assassination of President Lincoln. After his retirement, he was writing these articles in the New York paper, and they were all about these unusual spiritualistic seances that were going on. Well, the seances for me, reading about them were very interesting because they were taking place at something called the Eddy Farm up in Vermont. And people said they were going there. The way it sounded like they were almost going into a movie theater with, watching all of these things take place. And so Blavatsky basically, in reading about this, and probably by predetermined kind of mystical insight, shows up at the Eddy Ranch. And she walks in there, and Olcott is completely struck by her presence. And he says, we've been watching all this weird phenomena. For example, it looked like the image, like a ghost woman was coming through. And we were trying to create this atmosphere. And he said, as soon as Blavatsky showed up, all of these very unusual people were coming in from the astral plane. And in these seances, all of a sudden, there were Arabs and Egyptians and all kinds of exotic people showing up. And he knew that it was her presence that was conjuring all this kind of wild stuff. So she said, I'm here to basically establish a public mystery school. And I want to do theosophy here. And I want, you to introduce me to people in New York. And he was very drawn to the whole situation, but he was reluctant too, because he was like, this isn't going to be easy. And she has like a tough accent. And she doesn't have such a great personality, but she has this incredible psychic ability. Let's see what we can do. So in the middle of all this, it turns out over time that these were efforts by the mystery schools to integrate into the culture a new spiritual wave. One of those waves that came in, which forms the foundation of NASA, if you connect the dots properly, was the Golden Dawn. As I mentioned earlier, Johannes Trithemius, very unusual abbot in the 16th century, 21-year-old abbot. And he wants to get these magical rituals out, and he also doesn't want to be exposed. So he writes them using this steganography, and he gets it out. Now, those scrolls eventually turn up in an antique store, and we have someone named McGregor Mathers, who's this incredible polymath, who is doing all these interpretations of these famous books like the Hermetica and things of this nature. And he's bringing them into Western culture, doing these, translating a lot of these Eastern books. And he's a genius. And so he stumbles into this antique place, and he sees these weird scrolls. And with the scrolls, he recognizes the steganography is based on this older steganography that is basically this kind of Enochian magic language from John Dee. And he says, I have to have these, And not only that, but he learns by exploring the scrolls about a group that's in Germany that he can contact. And this is how he gets involved and meets the so-called secret chiefs of the mystery schools of the Golden Dawn. Well, he goes through this entire process, and he's building up the Golden Dawn. And in the middle of it, Aleister Crowley shows up, a young Aleister Crowley. Now, Crowley's very interesting because he's a genius at school. And but up until he's 10 years old, his father is an incredible Christian. Like they're from this heavy duty sect, and he teaches him to be the absolute pinnacle of Christian morality. And they say that basically Crowley was like the clone of his dad. He was, he would imitate him, and he was going to walk in his footsteps and be a minister and all the rest. So, as fate would have it, fate intervenes and the father dies, and it leaves a very young Crowley adrift with his mother, who doesn't get along with him very well and accuses him of not being religious enough. So she actually develops the nickname the Beast for him, which will follow him his entire life. So he gets the inheritance from his father when he turns 18 and flips out and basically travels all over the world. And he engages in all of this study. And the only thing he's interested in is a philosophical explanation for all of the kind of mysteries of the world. So he's a very curious person when he's younger, and he runs across MacGregor Mathers. And Mathers, he has a number of different kind of background stories, but in essence, what he does with his genius is he sets up the Golden Dawn. And the Golden Dawn, although Crowley gets involved and Crowley has all the kind of, black magic overhang, the Golden Dawn has nothing to do with black magic. It's a completely Rosicrucian style magic order. And that's what Trithemius was trying to get out, which is whatever he had stumbled into. He may have stumbled into it in the church that he was the abbot at the monastery, but whatever it was, he wanted it saved and preserved. So that's how we got the Golden Dawn years later. But when Crowley shows up, he learns all of these things, but he's so good at magic that he starts to overwhelm MacGregor with what he can do. And so between the two of them, there's a definite power struggle. And for years, this goes on until finally Crowley tries to take the order over. And Crowley has a number of unusual encounters over the years with entities that come to him. Now, I could chart them out, and I may do something about each one of these because there's something very powerful, I think, in what he got into and how that leads us to all of the occult offshoots now, and how you really get a split of the right-hand schools and the left-hand schools with the advent of Crowley jumping right in the middle of Golden Dawn. And by the way, Golden Dawn goes over the edge. By 1903, it's basically gone. It's like a 20-year golden period. In a sense, Theosophy also takes a dive. They have an incredible blossoming period with Blavatsky, and then the different schools decide she's a loose cannon, and they place her in a kind of psychic imprisonment, as Steiner called it. So we have all these things going on in the background, but the person we're going to follow is Crowley. Crowley decides, you know what? I know all the stuff that you guys know, and I don't need the Golden Dawn. Then if you want to throw me out, I'll do my own thing. And just wait, just you wait. So that's how we get Thelema, and that's how we get the Crowley religion and all the things that he would do. And he becomes more and more notorious with the things that he's doing. But I want to point out something which is missed very often in traditional ideas about Crowley, which is Crowley and a lot of the people around Thelema and the OTO and things of that nature, they don't think of themselves as Satan worshipers. They're not doing black magic as, kind of like voodoo rituals and things like that. They think that they are bringing the light in. And so, we have to kind of get our heads straight about who these people are, where they're coming from. They think that they are the new thing, that they are the new dispensation of a higher consciousness, and that it's stripping off the church and all this kind of thing. So the real satanic orders and things of that nature are totally different. But I think that you could qualify the stuff that Crowley's work turns into as pure left-hand society, as opposed to the right-hand mystery schools, Theosophy and Anthroposophy, etc. Although the language at times is very similar. And this is always what amazed me when reading Steiner's work, which is what you get is Steiner saying, well, brothers of the left-hand schools got together and did such and such and such. And then you think about it and you're like, why would, he even be talking about the left-hand schools? It's because the left-hand schools and the right-hand schools both operate in our daily lives. They're deep in the political process, and they are the mystery schools in the background. The problem is the left-hand schools are on kind of the, it's a major selfish trip, and the right-hand schools are all about moving the culture forward. But they each have those deep levels of knowledge. So they're both working off the same playbook. And in the public is kind of like their playground, basically, where they're trying to move the culture on one hand with the higher mystery schools, and then the secret societies are trying to manipulate that culture. But neither wants that information to come out to the culture that would give the culture too much information and have it self-destruct or whatever it would be. So they're both holding information outside of the public realm. That's the thing that gives them an acknowledgement of each other. So Steiner sees, or he talks about, well, there was a brother of the left hand who did this and did that. It's because he can see what they're doing, but they still, he wouldn't join in with them, or they wouldn't join with him, but they know also with him, okay, he's somebody who's on our level knowledge-wise. This is the important thing, I think, to understand about the schools. But how does space relate to it? And how did NASA come out of Crowley and the Golden Dawn? This is where we're going to go next, and this is where things get absolutely wild, and let us know what some of this setup of the mystery school war from that 19th century was all about. And it gets heavy. Before we go any further, Miss Olivia.
Elijah Muhammad Ali. So Crowley did to Mathers what Hubbard did to Parsons?
Yeah, it's interesting too. If you read Moonchild, there's a character in the book who is the arch villain, and he's Mathers. For Crowley, he was. But basically, I think that, I don't want to do a psychological profile of Crowley, but I do think that his mother, having that incredible disconnect with him and thinking he was the great beast and all that, and his father raising him to be a clone of himself, gave him an incredible pushback against Christianity. And as a matter of fact, this pushback against Christianity also exists in Blavatsky to a certain degree, and was exploited because they were able, so goes the theosophical cosmology, to go into her past lives and see, aha, she had been persecuted by Christian groups. Let's lay this Eastern thing on her and say that's what it's all about. Forget about the Western initiatory tradition. So they were able to do this a couple of times because Besant, who took Blavatsky's place, was also supposed to have been Giordano Bruno, who was burnt at the stake for saying, oh, the sun actually moves differently than, basically for questioning the church's astronomy. So there is this ability to do that. And we have to look at it and say, well, where has Christianity been abused? For example, I always think of Cortez upsetting, and destroying the Aztec civilization. So the idea of those crusades are very similar as well. We have the whole clash with the Templars and everything else. There are all these echoes of where the Christianity side becomes zealous, and then we have all of this. So there's a lot of pushback, I think, in the souls of these people. And so when you get someone like Crowley, when he feels that he has the key to another occult system and can break out of this thing, that he felt oppressed by as a youth, then he's like, I'm going to throw out Christianity and I'll do this whole other thing. But he doesn't think of himself as being satanic. I think that's important. As a matter of fact, he's often saying, by connecting in with this new ion and creating, this new Horus Age of Aquarius thing, I'm creating the new world. This is the new age. So it's a very interesting thing into how we think of him, and how he gave himself this image as well, because he was coming from, with Golden Dawn, coming out of a Rosicrucian tradition. And you get a lot of crisscrosses there with the Masonic piece on top of that as well. So whereas the Masonic part stretched out and twisted as well, it gets very interesting because you also have, the Masonic order maintaining the rules of the schools for so many years. So you've got all kinds of different pieces going on there. It's interesting. Crowley at a certain point writes a book, and he talks about these certain exercises that you do. And the leaders of the OTO which are founded by master masons. They get in touch with him and say, "Why are you releasing our highest degree in your book?" And he says, I didn't release your highest degree. What are you talking about? He said, "Yes, you did." And they went over it, and they said, "Now we have to initiate you into our order." And then he gets initiated into OTO. And they're like, basically, you can take over because you already know the secret. And that's how he becomes the main driving force in OTO. So there's a lot of interesting things, I think, that happen there. In the middle of it all, there's a lot of things, I think, in his history and his bio that are interesting. One is he's a mountain climber. Two is that he visits as far away as Africa and Tibet and India, and he tries to translate ancient Indian books and things. So he's very well knowledgeable about all of the ancient traditions. The thing is, he slips into, through this distortion in his soul, he slips into drug abuse. He slips into tossing out all the things that he's learned, really, and he becomes this heavy duty kind of black magician. Now, it's funny too. There's a picture of him with his family, and that's him with his wife and daughter when they lived in India. And I mean, it's weird. Some of these people, as I've pointed this out before with Gurdjieff and others, they seem to have very, very different, like you would not even recognize that as Crowley. So they have all of these different sides to them. And I think that that's a big key when looking at some of this stuff. This is the actual cross of the Golden Dawn. There's so much going on in that. Miss Olivia, this one's for you.
Wow.
Just incredible. But if you think about it, this lets us know that they're basically, the Golden Dawn is an esoteric Christian foundation. That's where they have the Christian mysteries at the core. And I think what happens is the influence of the Golden Dawn is blocked. It's taken off course. And then we have this kind of runaway thing where Crowley goes downhill after getting out of it. So, you can say about the Golden Dawn, interference maybe is what gets, them completely off the track. It's interesting too, when I was looking at, there was a whole thing about this captain. They have a female Captain Marvel, and they have this whole Avengers series. But it was interesting because the logo for Thelema, which is Crowley's religion, that he develops after the Golden Dawn, is this. And then if you really look at Captain Avenger and her logo, she's, it's damn close. I'll put it to you that way. So I think that the threads and the pieces from Crowley have completely, carved out and served as the template for the 21st century that we're in. So I think what you have basically is, in the 19th century, the setup of the clash of the mystery schools, and then both sides letting things out, the right-hand path and the left-hand path. And here we have this big squeeze in the early part of the 21st century, this heavy harmonic emphasis on technology. And part of that is related directly to space. That's the piece that we're going to go to. Of course, Crowley featured, if you know your music history, that is Crowley featured. I don't have anything to point with. Well, that is Crowley featured on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. Can I have that pen?
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Gracias. And he's way over here. But it's interesting. What happens is there's this incredible renaissance of Crowley's work once the 60s hit. And it's almost like the Laurel Canyon piece and all that thing becomes completely under the spell of Crowley's magic. And you have a whole outside philosophy coming in with the Crowley thing. And then around it is this whole, kind of black magic side. And so you find groups infiltrating in the 60s and 70s into Los Angeles, into Hollywood, and all the rest of it. So the entire industry becomes an esoteric experiment of someone's. And it is interesting to me too that on the music side, it seems like the all the influences get picked up in that period. So that when we get into the 60s, you've got this huge renaissance around all the positive mystery schools as well. That's when Edgar Casey's work becomes popular. And, he had done a lot for a number of years, but in his own life, he wasn't recognized hardly at all. But in the 1960s, Jess Stern writes The Sleeping Prophet, and everyone knows who Edgar Casey is. And it grows from there. Everyone wants to know. And it just so happens that these people have collected the readings, 14,000 readings in Virginia Beach. And so all of these different writers descend on it because they're like, well, if this guy can write a bestseller with this, so are we. And the Gurdjieff work becomes huge. The Steiner stuff does come in, but it's got a much longer route. It's much more obscure coming in. And I would say it's coming in on a kind of a higher level too. It seems like since it comes in through the Waldorf schools, it's like the well-to-do people know about Steiner, but it takes a while for that to filter down. I think the Gurdjieff work, Theosophy, Casey and all that was way more out front. Steiner's work seems particularly saved for the 21st century. All right. How does this all get us to Sirius? What is Sirius in relation to the mystery schools? Let's find that out. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist NASA X Occult UFO File Mystery Special. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly. And I do feel like this piece around Sirius is particularly important because it ties in the Masonic rites in relation to space, NASA, and also the mystery school emphasis. This was written by a student of Gurdjieff, J.G. Bennett, who we've profiled in this program a few times. But he's talking about Gurdjieff writing a book called Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, which Gurdjieff wrote at the end of his life, and they released it. Now, the book that made Gurdjieff sort of famous or semi-famous is Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous, where he details between 1915 and 1924 spending all this time with Gurdjieff and then breaking away from him when he found out, I respect and follow the teaching, but I can't get along with Gurdjieff. Well, the book is remarkable and wasn't released until Ouspensky died in 1947. But Gurdjieff will die a couple of years later. By the way, Gurdjieff said of In Search of the Miraculous, it's exactly what happened. But Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson is kind of like the Ulysses of esoterica. It's very hard to read. There are words in there intentionally set to throw you off. So it was Bennett who helped Gurdjieff put the book together. And so he's talking, he makes a statement and he says, after Gurdjieff died, I was asked by some of the old pupils to write a commentary on Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson. When I had written a few chapters and sent them around for comment, almost all the students agreed that it would be a mistake to publish them. If Gurdjieff had intended his meaning to be readily accessible to every reader, he would have written the book differently. He himself used to listen to chapters read aloud, and if he found the key passages taken too easily and therefore almost invariably too superficially, boy, we see a lot of that now, he would rewrite them in order, as he put it, to, quote, bury the dog deeper. When people corrected him and said, surely you mean bury the bone deeper, he would turn on them and say, it was not bones, but the dog that you have to find. The dog is Sirius, the dog star, which stands for the spirit of wisdom in the Zoroastrian tradition. Now, this is a big piece because we have a lot associated with the UFO lore and alien contact and all of these different things in relation to Sirius. And also there's a huge, connection to Sirius and the pyramids and the ancient Egyptian culture and so on. The fact that Gurdjieff is laying this on so heavily, and Gurdjieff having been in those mystery schools, he's giving us a huge hint there. This is something that's hanging around in the middle of all this. Beelzebub's Tale, remember, tells the story of Beelzebub with his grandson flying in a spaceship through the galaxy and landing on Earth at different key times in history, including during Atlantean times. And during the Atlantean times, they have a very worked out, highly technological culture. Big surprise there. But also, what's interesting for me is that there is a kind of a space visitor vibe in the middle of it, and here is Gurdjieff moving to Sirius in saying that's where we're burying the information. So somehow there's a serious connection in relation to the Gurdjieff work in Beelzebub's Tales. Let's take that a little bit further and try to draw these things together. Now, there's a gentleman named George Ellery Hale who was this incredible scientist who basically built up CalTech, and he's very involved in we did a special on him called The Sun King, and this is maybe from an episode of about 2 years ago. And there's some remarkable information. He's always in the background on a number of our reports. Hale was obsessed with Akhenaten, and many of the things that he does to the CalTech campus will imitate the Aten, which is the big god symbol of the Akhenaten religion. That's a picture of one of the things that he did. Well, it's not showing up too clearly. Right above, I'll tweet the picture out because it's getting it's getting washed out. But right above there, what you can see is the Aten and all the rays coming down, and that's the doorway to the telescope in CalTech. Now, one of the interesting things is that there's a whole piece about the group that studied at CalTech, that studied with Parsons, and that they would go up through the telescope and look at the dog star Sirius and do their rituals to Sirius. So again, we have Sirius in the mix when you get into the rituals that our friend Jack Parsons was doing. We're going to get into Parsons here as we unravel the real deep history of occult NASA and go deeper, maybe, than they'd like us to go. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X-Series special. And we've got the NASA X Occult UFO File mystery. Going to be taking your questions shortly here. I want to remind you, if you are watching and you're new, go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for that newsletter. That's the way we keep in touch. And it lets us know, basically all the shows that are coming up. You'll stand up and be counted. And it'll let you know the incredible things that we have coming up for you. Because we've seen a lot of heavy duty social media censorship on important stories that you need to see. And the best way to avoid it is to make sure you're on that newsletter list. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia.
Okay, Catherine Farrell. Did Crowley work with the military to open a portal to introduce an alien being into this dimension?
Well, he worked with UK intelligence during both world wars. So what he did for them, they said he was doing spying and decoding codes and creating codes, steganography, in fact. But in terms of rituals and things that he did for Churchill and stuff, it's hard to say because they wouldn't let any of that stuff out. But they used him for sure. The Russian government used Gurdjieff, just like they used Rasputin. And the other thing that's interesting in relation to that is Bennett met Gurdjieff in 1923 when he was spying on him. Because Gurdjieff had gotten very cozy with a Turkish prince, and they wanted to know all this stuff about him. So Gurdjieff is there spying on Gurdjieff, and then he's like, Bennett is spying on Gurdjieff, and he decides, oh my God, like this guy can change my life. So I kind of love the irony of that story. And I always, whenever I bring up Bennett, I love to tell the story about Gurdjieff saying, all right, well, you're interested in all this esoterica. What would you like me to teach you? I can teach you. And he says, well, I want to learn how to astral project out of my body and see what's going on, And Gurdjieff said, I can teach you that in a half hour. And he says, okay, clear your mind, picture yourself leaving your body. And he gives him this exercise. And then he says, I'll leave you alone. And he comes back in a half hour. And Bennett says, Gurdjieff says, what happens? And Bennett says, nothing. I didn't feel anything. And Gurdjieff said, no, it works. Okay, just do it until it works. Keep doing it. I'll come back. So then he's doing it. And suddenly he dislodges from his body, and he's up above his body, looking down at his body, sitting in a chair doing the exercise. And just then he sees the door open, and he looks at Gurdjieff, who looks at him sitting there in the chair, and then looks up at his astral body and gives him a little like, huh, oh, you figured it out, and closes the door. So this is the incredible practicality of the Gurdjieff gift, which is recounted by students over the years, over and over again. So we know when Gurdjieff was giving out this information, he understood and had been in some kind of secret environment where these skills were imparted to him and were very easy for him, that he could teach someone to astral travel in a half hour. Think about that. Quite profound. All right, more serious. And how does the serious trail lead us on to our friend? This gets very interesting. Jack Parsons is going to come right into the serious line. All right, now this is a book called Saucers of the Illuminati, great title, by Jim Keith, who's a remarkable writer who died too soon and many feel was eliminated because he'd gotten really close to, in his studies, Secret and Suppressed and the Men in Black and things of this nature, he'd just gotten really close. And I knew a lot of people who worked with him, and he was the real deal. He just was a smart guy who stumbled into this stuff. So he says he's talking about the Sirius star system, and he connects it up with this character, Lamb, that is portrayed and painted by Crowley. Crowley does an art exhibit called Souls of the Dead. Isn't that nice? And he does an art exhibit in Greenwich Village, and it's very successful in 1919. Now, one of those characters is this Lamb extraterrestrial character, and that's pretty early, 1919. We're getting on with it. So this is what Keith has to say. At the beginning of this century, contact with the Sirius star system was claimed by occultist Lucien Francois Jean Maine, who, through this famous occult papist, learned the rituals of the OTO Lodge founded by Aleister Crowley. Now, through the famous, he formed his own group in his native Haiti. Jean Maine is said to have, in 1922, combined the OTO rituals with a voodoo practice of the cult of the Black Snake. I've only looked into that briefly, but it's very strange. He also claimed to be in contact with a disembodied being named Lamb, an entity who OTO Grandmaster Kenneth Grant said was one of the great old ones, an elder identical with those portrayed in the American horror writer H.P. Lovecraft. So, one of these very unusual wisdom elders, as it were. Lamb, according to Kenneth Grant, who's an associate biographer of Crowley, has the task of uniting the current that emanates from the Andromeda galaxy with the current that flows from Sirius. Grant believed that a dimensional portal exists in the Andromeda galaxy, and through this portal will enter the old ones, demonic entities intent on returning to Earth, to their dominion, and having humanity for breakfast. That's the way Keith writes. Prior to Jean Maine's contact with Lamb, the famous occultist and founder of the OTO, Aleister Crowley, reported that he had summoned the same entity through one of his own magical workings with a K. Crowley also penned a drawing of Lamb, another strange dimension to the now interdimensional puzzle. Crowley portrays the entity Lamb as a prototypical big-headed gray, i.e. is the picture of a modern popular conception about what a UFO alien is supposed to look like. Crowley relates that Grant, who unequivocally identifies his holy guardian angel as Sirius. The obvious connection here is the significance of Sirius through the Ordo Templi Orientis Lodge. Crowley and Lamb have their own special relevance. Now, there's a whole thing that comes up in here about the viewing room at the Palomar Observatory. And we know that Ellery Hale is also associated with this. This is how this all came about. And he gets the money from Rockefeller, of all people. Let's go a little bit further with this. First, that's the picture of Lamb, of course. It's in the thumbnail, but it's an extraordinary image painted by Crowley of this entity that came upon him, and all he could say about it was, this incredible wisdom emanated from him. And I had been studying at the time all this Tibetan information, and the name Lam was associated with the way. So somehow Lam means the way. But what Lam was trying to impart was, I can give you all this information if you can handle it, kind of thing. It was very much like a typical abduction experience, the way that he describes it. Now, it's interesting, some of the classic features of the Greys. In comparison with Lam, it's quite interesting because there is something about this centering on the large head, which these entities seem to have, whether they're interdimensional or alien. The head seems to be the object, and the body seems to be slight and almost, barely holding up the head. That's the interesting thing. But if you were existing in this kind of, if you're in space, you're weightless, yes. But if you exist in the astral plane, then the emphasis goes just to the head. Betty Hills Jr., that she encountered, it's different than a traditional Grey, but it's still, it has a resemblance going on. And there's a weird connection with Sirius with the Betty Hill case as well. Let's get a little more going. Of course, let's not forget that Betty Hill's character gave her the location of where they came from on this map. That's all pretty interesting too. And the fact that she recalled it under hypnosis, and then years later they discovered the star formation that she saw on the map. Again, just there's so many things underlining the Hill case, which make it fascinating. Couple of quick things here about Sirius. Evaluating the mishmash of occultism, who would imagine that the telepathic transmission from Sirius might have something to do with military intelligence. Occult investigator James Shelby Downard, we all are very familiar with him. He's the Kill King, and he did that incredible occult symbolism of the JFK assassination, and he did secret societies, the whole book on secret societies. And they're interesting because their essays turned into books. They're not, written as a whole book, but they're very interesting. This one is called Sorcery, Sex, Assassination, and the Science of Symbolism. And it's published in the Secret and Suppressed anthology. But he researches the existence of a serious worship cult that he believes exists at the highest levels of, are you ready? The CIA. That would open up a lot. I could go deeper, and I could spend all night with you here just on Keith's book and Sirius. But what I want to do is thread this through. So we have a serious connection with Lam. We have this interesting Sirius connection going on with what Gurdjieff says to Bennett about Beelzebub's tales. Now that Sirius piece takes us to this group that got together at CalTech, and one of them was Parsons, and they were obsessed with using the telescope to look at the dog star and do rituals, look at Sirius. Now we know there's a group in Africa, and it's an absolutely fascinating story about how they worship Sirius B and the dog star in their religion, and how they knew the location of the star long before traditional astronomy did, the Dogon tribe, and that there was something in relation to it. So again, just like the Betty Hill thing, she saw something that they didn't discover until later. And then in the case of the Dogon tribe, they didn't discover this thing that they were seeing. The science didn't discover what they knew, and they did in their rituals. And we'd been going and observing their rituals since the 19th century. And Sirius, and the visitors from the dog star gave them their culture. And so in this tradition of the Dogon, they have the priest, and he can't touch anyone, and he can't have a normal life like anyone else. He's just there to communicate and do the ritual of the Dogon for the Sirius B thing. And, they do have video of this ritual, and it is quite remarkable. But the Dogon are portrayed with this huge elongated head in the mask, and they're unusually gigantic. These things look like kind of cranes going around. But that's Sirius as well. So we're getting an incredible crossover here with Sirius. And when we think of how important that Crowley and our friend becomes as setting up NASA, then this becomes very interesting. Remember also that Parsons' name originally was Marvel Whiteside. And, we're getting a hint around him. He comes from this very affluent family. And, they're very interested in having him get into this scientific career. But what happens is they lose all this money during the Depression. And so his skills creating the rockets and the things that would actually eventually take us to the moon are put to incredible use in the 30s when he is literally 21, 22, 23 years old, very young. And so the original setup for the rocket program in America is highlighted by the fact that he's having these conversations long distance in Germany, costing his family all this money. And who is he talking to on the other end? According to him, Wernher von Braun. Well, von Braun, when he's talking about NASA and the heroes associated with NASA, mentions Parsons. So those two had that relationship. So what were they talking about? Another interesting piece about Parsons is that he and Frank Molina, and Molina's very important, and he's someone who worked deep in aerospace. He was part of the deep state, and he eventually became an artist. And he did the most incredible tripped out art you've ever seen in your life. But when he was working with Molina, they wrote a book together, and it was all about basically how these Nazi scientists wanted to get their hands on extraterrestrial technology, and how this good group in America, basically Parsons and Molina, were developing the rocket technology as fast as they could to fend off this German rocket program, which supposedly barely existed at the time. So there's something in the relationship of Parsons with von Braun, which has not been touched on, and it's still hard to get a handle on. Remember, NASA has got rid of so much of the Parsons history and the things that he did. One thing we know for sure is that they named a crater on the moon after him. And of course, that he started the JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which is extraordinary because all else follows from that. Let's get into a little more Parsons as we go here, and then we'll take your questions in the next, say, 10 minutes. How does that grab you?
Sounds good.
All right. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is a special report tonight, NASA X Occult UFO File Mystery. It's great to have so many of you here with us, and we'll go on a little bit further here. When I was talking about the Parsons piece in relation to rocketry, it's easy to overlook the fact that the rocket program basically was started with Goddard and Parsons. But the place where Goddard was doing, and the funding he was getting, was from Guggenheim, which is also quite remarkable. We think of Guggenheim in terms of art, books, auction houses, all kinds of things, but we don't think of them in terms of rockets. Well, the Guggenheims were very deep early in aerospace, and the place that they wanted Goddard to set off his rockets was, get ready for it, Roswell, New Mexico. But this is 1931, and that's 16 years before the Roswell incident happens. So why were they so interested in Roswell? We did this whole thing about David Depula last week, and he's the very interesting, now retired NATO general. He's very deep in all these aerospace companies. But the company he was working for, they were there at Roswell. It seems that Roswell just attracts the aerospace aspect. There's something there which is a little bit beyond normal, extra normal, as it were. And it's very interesting if you go back and look at that history a little bit. You're going to find Lindbergh there at Roswell. It's like, geez, everybody's there. It reminds me of Dealey Plaza. Dealey Plaza is supposed to be just one little patch that President Kennedy's going by. Well, the prime minister from Hungary is there. French assassins are there. It's like, why is everybody in Dealey Plaza just at that moment? There's a good reason for that. Okay, so Parsons, the occult, Cameron, rockets, I think what we can say about Parsons is he's a real seeker, and he was a genius, and he wanted something that was, extra normal, extra magical abilities. And he was probably somebody who, through his fantasy life, conjured things into reality. And so he had a remarkable imagination. Here he is with Melina, and this is the group that they called the suicide or kamikaze squad because of their rocket experiments were so dangerous. But they were the ones who were getting results, and investors took notice. And as a result, for a while, Melina and Parsons became very rich. And he set up something there, this kind of Parsons Ranch over in Pasadena. Now, along the way, a couple of the kind of key things I think in his life that happen is that he encounters Ron Hubbard. And Hubbard is showing all this interest in Crowley's work. And over this period of when he's 21 to when he's 26, Parsons becomes absolutely infatuated with OTO and Thelema. And that is him over there doing one of the rituals of the OTO. And he is now working the magic stuff into his rocket research. And he claims that it is through doing these rituals that he's getting the insights and the help, as it were. This is where he's coming from on it. Over time, this will work against him, and he'll become a huge outcast from the fact that he's doing ritual magic, and he's associated with all these scandals and the incredible sex magic that Parsons is involved in, which is recounted in Sex and Rockets. And the name of that writer is John Carter. And I don't know if he ever let out his real name, but that's a pseudonym. And when that book came out, I knew that this was someone who had intense information around Parsons and all that. And I asked the publisher to interview him. This is a while ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And they said, no, we can't do that, but you can talk to the publisher. And unfortunately, the publisher didn't know a whole heck of a lot about it. But it was interesting to me because the book really, if you go into it, you can see the levels to which Parsons was taken in and thought he was the main man for OTO. Here's what's interesting about OTO. First of all, the only lodge in the U.S. at that time for the OTO, Order Templi Orientis, was in Pasadena. That's crucial. Two, as we've pointed out, Pasadena seems to be central for a lot of X activity, technology, mysticism, etc. And three, the very dark aspects around George Hodel, Black Dahlia, all the strange ritual stuff that he was doing with Man Ray before getting accused of all these murders. That has nothing to do with Parsons, technically. But there's something about them running in tandem time-wise in that same kind of Los Angeles area. And then when you go to, when you're looking at Pasadena and you're thinking about the number of things like CalTech that we get so much influence from, you can see it as a major, I call this stuff X geography when I run across it. Roswell is definitely part of that X geography. Pasadena, Moon, Pennsylvania. I think they try to keep us focused on Area 51 when we get around this stuff, but I think I think things have happened there, of course, but I think there's a whole vast area going on in relation to this stuff. Okay. Ad astra per aspera, to the stars through hardship, was Parsons' motto. It's interesting because per ad astra is what in The Men Who Fell to Earth, the scientist says to Bowie's Jerome Newton character. I find it interesting. It's kicking around, and it may be an homage, as it were. Is there something about Parsons' story that isn't just about the stars in an astronomical sense, but in the Hollywood sense too. It is a story of self-invention and transformation. And so there's all this information about Parsons and how he envisioned the world. And he would write books about his vision for the world. And he sounds almost like an early libertarian in a sense, but he certainly has a whole kind of utopian vision around the whole thing. What he does, and this is often misunderstood, he picks up when he contacts Aleister Crowley, and he becomes one of his favorite students. And then Aleister Crowley gives him the charter to open the OTO in Pasadena. Now, their communication is intense, and he basically is throwing the whole role of father onto Crowley. What Crowley tells him is, in the work that you do, you need to avoid vampires. This is very interesting. But there's a lot of very interesting conversation, and a lot of those letters are still around to review the conversations that they have. But they are in touch constantly through the phone and through mail, and but they only meet on very rare occasions. So the group that gets set up at CalTech consists of 3 people, and it's Parsons, Frank Molina, and this other guy, Percy Foreman. They had diverse backgrounds and interests, but their skills were perfectly complementary. Parsons was the group chemist. Remember that Crowley was a chemist in school as well. Grew up on Millionaire's Row in Pasadena. Scion of a rich family from back east, but his family lost their money during the early years of the Depression, so he was unable to afford college. He had enthusiasm for 100 different subjects: poetry, classical music, the occult, explosives, and above all, rockets. Now, it's interesting because he'll become such an explosives expert that he will be taken in by the police when they have a case involving bombings of people, and he'll be used as an expert witness. But it is also explosives that will take him out in the end. And this gets interesting because he's under investigation by the FBI, and his wife claims that he's assassinated when his studio explodes, which I have to say, that's where I lean to as far as the end of Jack Parsons, unfortunately. So he has this incredible talent, and he puts together a company called Aerojet. Now, Aerojet shows up in all of the early UFO cases. Almost all the people who report anything are from Aerojet. And you'll notice that that's pretty interesting. They're all involved in some way. And then if you go a little bit deeper, you're going to find that Parsons' mother worked for Lockheed. So you're right already in this crisscross of defense contractors developing this ability, first through the World War program, and then with the space program. And as we get deeper into it, that's a shot of Molina there. Molina, who we've brought up in other episodes, deserves his own episode, because when he switched from aerospace to art, it became very interesting what was going on there. But he's definitely an ex-player. This was the magic box that Parson used that Crowley gave him. It was discovered only after his death, and it's definitely unusual. It's hard to see there, but there's a pentagram on it, and this is the box from which he did his rituals and things. So when we get into what was going on with Parsons, he had an incredible vision for this before it actually came to pass. So he was bringing forward the formulas, he was doing the tests and all the rest of it. And he was working through CalTech because he had the influence there, and they were hiring him out for different projects. So through Aerojet, they're able to get all these contracts with the government, and it affords them the ability to travel and all these different things. And what happens in a short period of time is someone decides, okay, we've got the technology, we don't need these guys anymore. And Molina is suddenly under investigation because he visits a communist dissident. And then he gets hounded by the government Parsons is starting to get too far into his Crowley OTO role, and he runs afoul of authorities. They're starting to crack down on him. And then the other guy has financial problems. And by the end of it, basically, Aerojet is gone and Parsons is broke. Now, the person who shows up in the middle of all this chaos to kind of hasten along Parsons' demise is L. Ron Hubbard. Now, for me, Hubbard basically hijacks or steals the theme of a space religion directly from Parsons. And I'll tell you how this works. Parsons is very imaginative, but so is our friend Hubbard. And Hubbard, we have an episode coming up on. Hubbard is someone who has written 50 science fiction books by the time he meets our friend. And he's just incredibly prolific, cranking these things out. And you could say in some ways Dianetics is the ultimate science fiction mystery. But what he decides over time is he figures out that, Crowley stuff is the way to go, and I'm doing all these rituals with you and all the rest. And they become partners in this ritualistic magic. Now, it's interesting about Hubbard, though, because he shares with Parsons. He says, if we could only put together religions are tax-free. We wouldn't face any of these financial problems at all. And we could use all of this, basic philosophy and things that Crowley's discovered, and we could plug it in and make ourselves a new religion. And, basically Parsons is like, no, I'm loyal to Thelema, and, I'm going to do the Crowley thing, and I'm getting so many results with it. Let's stick to these rituals. Later, as we can see, Hubbard will do exactly that, form his own religion and attempt to become a tax-free haven while doing it. There's a remarkable history of the fact that the third stage rockets that create the first ability for us to send rockets into space that von Braun will use in the late 50s come directly from the technology that Parsons invented. The influence, how Crowley's influence and his obsession with space makes Parsons such an excellent inventor for this. And that crisscross of the homage inside of NASA to Magic with a K and Crowley is interesting because there's so many magic rituals and esoteric symbols associated with any major trip that we've done relating to NASA and the moon, for example. So all of this goes back to this original Golden Dawn piece. Now, how does the Moonchild fit in? Here's something I want to really get on the record. So this is interesting to me about Moonchild. Moonchild is about a celestial person, someone who can exist in space. And Crowley's writing in 1917 about conceiving a Moonchild, and how and Parsons believes that if he does the ritual for Moonchild, he'll create this child that can live in space because he thinks the future is in space. Now, if you think about how that comes back to us now and some of the kind of more occult things we've seen around Elon Musk, then we start to really put together the picture a little bit around this. And we start to see, space and the occult, they're joined together because it's an understanding. It's a piece of understanding of magical ritual. It's of ritual magic. And what's interesting is Moonchild, if you get into the plot summary, check out some of those. It's an interesting book, but I read it as a teenager. And for me, when I was reading it, I was thinking, this is an interesting novel. It didn't, when I found out later the extent of Crowley, after having read Moonchild, it was very interesting to me. I was like, isn't it funny that this, crazy Satanist, well, like I said, in fact, he wasn't, but that's the image, was writing this kind of almost normal novel. So the book goes a year or so before the beginning of World War I, a young woman named Lisa LaJoufria is seduced by a white magician, Cyril Gray. Now, I believe this is what Crowley saw himself as. I think he saw himself as a gray character, not white magic, not black magic. Persuaded into helping him in a magical battle with a black magician and his black lodge. Gray is attempting to save and improve the human race and condition by impregnating a girl with the soul of an ethereal being, the Moonchild. To achieve this, she will have to be kept in a secluded environment, and many preparatory magical rituals will be carried out. The black magician, Douglas, is bent on destroying Gray's plan. However, Gray's ultimate motives may not be what they appear. The Moonchild rituals are carried out in Italy, but the occult organization is based in Paris, in England. That's also very interesting. At the end of the book, the war breaks out and the white magicians support the Allies while the black magicians support the Central Powers. This is the foundational piece.
Wait, can you say that last piece again about the black and the white magicians and who supports who?
When the war breaks out, the white magicians support the Allies while the black magicians support the Central Powers. Now, this is interesting too because, of course, they recruited, the Brits recruited Crowley. So he's kind of tuning in and placing some of reality in the book. But what caught me is that they want to raise the child in isolation. And this is how, if it's raised in isolation, it can be compatible with this ethereal space piece. Check this out. It gets very, very interesting and strange here if we're keeping Sirius in mind. NASA has a program called Sirius. Now, this program is interesting because they have all of these people who want to sign up for it. And the idea is you're going to simulate on Earth what it would take to have a space colony. And so you have all the withdrawing from the public and all the rest. Before humans go to Mars, NASA has practice missions on Earth. The Sirius missions are the latest spaceflight analogs NASA is utilizing to help us understand the risks of travel further into the solar system, as if you haven't gone already. The groundbreaking analog is a complement to human research being conducted at the International Space Station. The analog environment is a situation on Earth that produces effects on the body similar to that experienced in space, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Sirius is interesting in that they suggest you're going to be living in isolation, and they have a whole program for women because it's all about the Artemis project, which, you know, Artemis is going to the moon, and that's all about female astronauts. Now, I find it interesting that a century later, in fact, we're getting the Moonchild on a technological scale. And with that, Miss Olivia, I have a lot more of Parsons, but I'm going to go to your questions.
Okay, Jason T. May. So Barbara Bush is the Moonchild?
That's great. Hey, listen, of all the things that are out there, and we've mentioned this before, but, you know, you always see these stories and it's like, was John Trump the secret father of Julian Assange and things like that? And there's nothing to back it up. But the story of Barbara Bush being the child of Aleister Crowley actually has incredible threads in it, in as much as Barbara Bush, the mother, went over and visited Crowley in Italy, you know, right in the period of time before she had Barbara and conceived Barbara. So it is certainly plausible. I've always felt like there was a physical resemblance with Barbara Bush and Aleister Crowley, and we know that the Bushes are deep on the deep state side. So all of that, you know, rings bells for me. You know, we can't say for certain, but absolutely, of all the stories that have spun around and just been like, you know, every once in a while you hear like, hey, you know, Bush is this guy named Scherf who was Tesla's assistant, you know, nothing to back it up. But the Barbara Bush story, yes.
Okay. Bob, isn't Frank Molina's son married to one of Ghislaine Maxwell's sisters?
Yes, they are. I'm trying to think of the names there, but there is a crisscross with Maxwell's and Molina. And the Molina story and the artwork associated with it. There's something very deep going on there. The fact that he was hombres with our friend Parsons, and they basically created Aerojet. And like I said, if you look at all those early stories, you're going to find Aerojet in the middle of all of the 50s UFO stuff. So there's something heavy to be unearthed in the middle of all that. And then again, we have Parsons right in the middle of it. But Parsons is simultaneously an advanced ex-scientist. He's right there at CalTech, and he is also esoterically connected to the OTO through Crowley directly. So, we have a very unusual character there. And then right in the middle of that, we have L. Ron Hubbard basically stealing his story and his boat and his money and his wife. And, I always make the point of this, which is in the middle of all these things, Parsons is writing these letters to Crowley, and he's like, it's this great guy, L. Ron Hubbard. And Crowley's like, I think I know who you're talking about. Like, watch out. And then as he hears more and more about him, he's like, I think he's a confidence man, and I think he's going to con you out of everything you have. And he's taking this role, and he's like, he doesn't sound like he has any morals, and if Aleister Crowley's calling you out on your moral structure, you've had it. But that's where you get Scientology. Yes.
David Tormina, DJ, I can confirm that our pal Luis Alvarez was advising a graduate student, Robert Otrog, at Berkeley, who was also a member of Jack Parsons' inner circle.
Oh, interesting. Wow. And the timeline is perfect for that. That is very interesting. And I'd love to hear more about that because, David's always good about picking up on themes and putting them together and putting them out there publicly on Twitter. It's amazing stuff that he has. What's interesting to me is Alvarez is one of those ex-players that I mentioned. And he's so deep in it. There's a level where when you get like an Alvarez or you get a Lloyd Berkner, where they're working on that, like Vannevar Bush, they're working with the UFO file. They're working with also the mystery school piece. And when you get around Alvarez, he spends all this time, over a decade in Egypt, studying the influence of cosmic rays, and to see if he can use cosmic rays to reveal hidden vaults in the Giza Plateau. Hall of Records, as Casey identified, and the room in the Great Pyramid. Well, later, as we know, just 3 months ago, I reported a story where they used cosmic rays that were, being utilized to find a shaft, a different opening in the pyramid. And they did it. They don't know what's in it. But the fact that they're using that technique, and he did it in the 70s. So here's why Alvarez is also a triple threat. He is the person who they assigned for the debunking of the Zapruder film Frontal Shot. So they used his photographic analysis to try to do that. It doesn't work, of course, because you can see it's a shot from the front, regardless of how many angles you jangle. We all know the shots came from the front. But what's interesting is to have him utilized, but he was also part of the Robertson panel with Berkner. So this is a guy, you can see that X trajectory. George Hunt Williamson, Morris Jessup. There's a trajectory that these people are on. They get really close in that X thing, and it's just fascinating to follow them. Yes.
Najat Madri, could Pasadena and similar cities be hotspots for underground bases or other kinds of activities?
Something, is going on there which eludes the surface. And I'll say that about Boston also. All these things relate back to Boston. I have a very important quote coming up from Albert Pike. But Albert Pike was from Boston. So Pike gives us a clue. There's a clue in Masonry to what's going to happen in the space program and what it's about. The blue space program is also highlighted in Pike's work, if you read it correctly. I'm going to do blue part 2. I've promised you that. So I'll save that Pike part for that episode, but I will give you this Pike part since you brought it up. And this is Pike, very interesting figure, and he's a Kabbalist who merges Kabbalah and Masonry and becomes basically the big chief of the Masonic side. And then when the war hits, he's on the Confederate side. And so it creates all these clashes and things. But his books are loaded with deep esoteric information that show his exposure on a mystery level. Now, check this out. He says, and the secret that he lets out in the book that he writes in 1871, that the star at every Masonic lodge that's on the floor, the one star, represents Sirius. So Pike is giving us what Gurdjieff was giving us and what we tripped into by ourselves. There's something about Sirius in relation to the mystical orders, but it's also in relation to the UFO file. What is it about Sirius? That becomes the question. But Pike is giving us some answer there. And for me, he's loaded with answers. Yes.
David Donaway, Vannevar Bush was a keen Freemason serving as master of the Richard C. McLaurin Lodge for members of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where Bush worked.
Exactly. Now, Bush took the secrecy he learned from that lodge, and I guarantee you that the strange place that I went to at MIT when I was 19 or whatever, that's one of the rooms that they used, because nobody could find that. It had to be one of the most secret places. The way that I got shown to it, for me, like that, they must have used it. It's interesting to learn about Vannevar Bush using the secrecy skills of the Masonic lodges as a Mason master to make the UFO file so foolproof. But they also used that for the Rad Lab so that they could develop the Manhattan Project. Interestingly enough, remember, as we know, Wilbur Smith put on the record that the UFO file was placed above the atomic bomb in terms of secrecy. So the UFO file is the ultimate secret inside the US government. That's it. Now, here's what's interesting, too. If you let anything real about the UFO file out, then you run the risk that these other countries pick it up like that. True. But these other companies have their own UFO programs. So, in the case of some of them, like Russia, they're either more advanced than we are or pretty damn close. It would be interesting to have a real analysis around that. But I would have to say damn close, if not superior, on the UFO side, as far as the UFO file goes. So here's the question. When it comes to Russia and the US, the whole thing that they put out, and this is why NASA debunked the GoFast thing, that thing was a manipulated radar signal that they wanted so that they could run this phony story with Elizondo and all that stuff. That has nothing to do with reality. When you get on the level of the actual players, the X-players, it has nothing to do with the obsters, right? X-player, obster. The obsters, forget it. They can throw them out there with junk that'll be debunked later. But in the meantime, they've had 3 years of a media career. They can run all over the place. They can sell books, whatever it happens to be. But it is interesting because the actual group will not release that technology because they know a group out there, like the Russians or the Chinese, who are close to us on the UFO file, if not superior, will be looking at it. And they'll have the ability to glean something from it if they put something actual out. So that's why you need, when you are going in the transparency direction, you need these things on the ground, and you need those understandings going forward. They never want anyone to have any access. They're not even so much worried as much about other countries as they are about us, because the minute that we get on their level on the UFO file, then it's a big problem for them. And frankly, I've always felt in relation to Trump, and now also in relation to Bobby Kennedy, that in terms of the Kennedy family, they know a great deal about this because Kennedy was deeply involved in the UFO file. John Kennedy was. So, you know, that explains some of getting rid of Kennedy. And in my opinion, he was eliminated over the UFO file. But Trump, the problem with Trump is he's somebody sitting across the table from them making a deal and saying, I've got the same knowledge on the UFO file as you do, when they've had it as their ultimate trump card for everything. And the problem is that the public is catching on. And so they're carting out a phony story with Tic Tacs and all that nonsense. So this is why you see this internecine battle taking place. That's why NASA is going to call out Elizondo's phony go fast, because they don't want it working like this. They don't want the obsters over here doing something that they're not in charge of. Well, the Space Force also doesn't want NASA to have the last word on this. And AARO wants funding, so they'll play everybody, right? And that's why you have all the real hardcore deal makers in there, like Rubio and Gillibrand, because they can attach the whole thing to the National Defense Authorization Act, and then they can come out and say, take a high five and say, hey, for all you UFO people, we made them develop a UFO office. Yeah, but what did you do it for? Did you make it so that you could easily fund a false UFO threat, and so that you could create emergency powers? Did you create an entire infrastructure of UFO defense by doing this? Did you get the money guaranteed in the background? Is that why you were so hardcore in demanding this thing? Because why else would you hold up $1 trillion National Defense Authorization Act? You're not a UFO enthusiast. I don't think Marco Rubio has a UFO enthusiast bone in his body, except he's an opportunist. And Gillibrand also, her dad had a big position in British aerospace. So, her father-in-law, rather. Not only that, she has other sketchy connections, like the Nexium cult. So, I think that's a much more realistic thing. Sometimes you get this thing in people's heads, and I knew that nothing real was going to come out of the NASA meeting about UFOs. They were just like, oh, in order to get better sensors, we need more money. But the fact that they debunked Go Fast is an unexpected boon to blowing out that low-level CIA piece. Now they have, they're going to work with NASA for some other op, I'm sure, but that thing that they laid out through the New York Times, which we've debunked heavily here, it's nice to see the nail in the coffin on that thing, because that thing was horrible, and it had listed some of the worst liars that have ever been forced on the American public or the world. Okay.
QWERTY281, Parsons was likely given rocket technology from interdimensional beings. Sounds outrageous, but he said it. Thomas Marzek says Jack Parsons would pray to Pan before launching rockets.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Well, the Crowley posture, I don't know if I have that picture. It's in the thumbnail. That is the glorifying Pan posture with the two arms. That has to come from deep in a mystery school. That's where a lot of Crowley stuff that he lets out, let's make no mistake, he's deep in the mystery schools. The problem is he takes off on the left-hand side. And the do as thou wilt thing is kind of the opposite of what the right-hand schools do, which is, improve the world, basically. So it is interesting, though, because the Pan part and getting information from interdimensional is just like a lamb may have given so much information to Crowley, that becomes a very interesting interchange. When someone gets abducted by an alien, there's a lot of interesting things that happen also. Not all of them are traditional scientific examinations. Some of them involve very philosophical. The Betty Andreasson thing, they try to show her, the world and the world destroyed and things of this nature. And Andreasson's case is unusual because she was a born-again Christian, and they came on using Christian imagery and something that looked like a Bible. So they whatever intelligence is operating there knows how to appeal. But why are they appealing to that side of her mind? These become very important questions. The abduction phenomena is actually, you could probably get more answers with the abduction phenomena than with just examining the pure technological speeds, which can always be manipulated, and everything else. So when you look at that, I would think the abduction experience is a legit abduction experience. It can teach us a lot about the interaction that's going on there. But yeah, can you get information from an ethereal being of that level? Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's dangerous. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the danger?
Yes. Well, a lot of the people that we're talking about, even Mathers seem to have incredible, great intentions. But when you are working with, that realm, you have to be operating from a place where you can't be manipulated. And, so you run the risk when you use magic without the right intention, bringing in the wrong thing. So the same goes with any kind of communication. They say, in fact, that the Mayans originally were dealing with etheric teachers, and that's where Quetzalcoatl came from. And they was giving them incredible culture. Quetzalcoatl shows up as a white bearded figure, giving them all this wisdom and knowledge and things. But later, they're interacting on the ethereal level with a snake named Kukulkan. And Kukulkan is doing the same kind of role, but it's no longer human. It's the serpent giving them information. It sounds like Garden of Eden type imagery. But so I think it can get dicey. It's something, it's like every day you have to, kind of reaffirm your commitment to what you're doing. But when you deal with things, when you think about Crowley, and, in a sense, I mean, Crowley did remarkable things because, he believed in the thing. He took it to the limit. He wanted to contact other beings. So, he's kind of like an astronaut in a weird way. Like, he went off searching for a high vista. This is a guy who was a mountain climber, and, he did travel all over the world. So he had an incredible, insatiable appetite, but his desire to learn things ate him up. So there's that thing in the Bible where they say, well, what's good does it do to gain the whole world and lose your own soul? You have to be careful when you get up on that level. But you'd have to say that in looking at his body of work, that Crowley was a genius. There's no question about it. Yes.
Gigi Young says, attunement, we attract what we are.
Oh, that's really true. Wow. What level are you bringing in? I think the whole thing about purification and all the rest is so you can get yourself tuned properly while you're in the physical, to attune to something that isn't physical. And it's coming in from, a higher realm. That's where you're supposed to be going with it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep tonight in this X series special, going in on NASA X Occult UFO File mystery. We're going to be taking more of your questions. We'll go about another 10 minutes or so.
Okay.
Miss Olivia, you're up.
AO. So what's up with that damn portal Parsons opened but never closed, though? Has it been closed through another ritual?
No, this is important. There's a castle. Let's go back to the castle that Jimmy Page took over in Scotland that Aleister Crowley owned.
Is it? I know we pronounce it Boleskine, but it's Boleskine, right?
Yes, Boleskine. Really good memory on that. Thank you. There's a lot of interesting things there too, because even when Bowie was into the Kabbalah and all this stuff, when he encountered Page and Page tried to be like Crowley is the way or whatever, they had a really big standoff, and Bowie wouldn't talk to him afterwards. So Jimmy Page was really deep into this stuff. And when he bought the castle and all that, he wanted to conjure what Crowley was conjuring. Now, Crowley did that, and then they say that he didn't seal the ritual when it was over. And he got called away to go to France. And I think this was his attempt to take over the Golden Dawn happened. So that was one kind of thing of not closing.
What could be more important, like in France, than closing this ritual?
Taking over the Golden Dawn. But this is the thing. This is the problem with it, that it was an opportunist thing, apparently. Later, and you may not know this, but there are actually tape recordings of Hubbard doing the ritual with Parsons out in the desert. They recorded some of it. They're in the New Mexico desert.
No, but where are the
tapes?
Could anybody go listen to
that's
that?
A good question. I've heard
tapping into that is kind of scary.
Yeah, I've heard some of them. And they're out there. They're pretty interesting. The other thing I want to point out is that with the ritual stuff that they were doing, they did it in 46. And the idea was doing the Babylon working. And that is, there's a very long explanation to it, but there's this whole thing about a magical apprentice who's a female. And it's interesting because before he meets Marjorie Cameron, I've got a picture of somewhere here. Marjorie Cameron is interesting because her parents work for JPL, which is the company that he builds. In fact, he he creates that entire infrastructure. This is one guy we're talking about working with a team. But what goes on is very interesting because Marjorie Cameron shows up in a vision of Parsons before he meets her. And he does all this stuff to conjure this ethereal Babylon working magical apprentice woman. And he basically thinks he's going to have an ethereal girlfriend because he's been so disappointed by the fact that his girlfriend, his wife, has dumped him for L. Ron Hubbard, and Hubbard has taken off with his money and all this other stuff. So it's a weird two-step that takes place there where he conjures this woman. He has this relationship with her for 2 months, and then he meets her. And he's surprised. He'll record in his own diary that he's surprised that he meets her because he thought, this is all my imagination. So obviously he had some incredible psychic ability and imagination to be able to see this woman was coming. But it is weird.
How do you have a relationship? Okay, can you explain a little bit about what was going on?
No, he felt that he had conjured this woman and had a relationship with her on the astral plane. But remember this too.
In meditation and dream time, what exactly?
That he would go into the astral plane and project himself. But what's interesting.
Was it strictly like a sexual relationship?
No, I think it was the whole thing.
Okay.
And what's interesting too is that Crowley, one of the things that Russell Targ told me about is that Crowley has a whole thing about sex on the astral plane.
Mm-hmm.
So, obviously he had picked up on this, but it's interesting to think about Parsons. If she hadn't actually showed up, you have to wonder what would have happened to this poor soul living in, this, having this ethereal ether plane girlfriend. She herself has magical abilities. She's also psychic. And Crowley, when he is writing to Parsons, he says, stay away from her, she's a vampire. Now, is that just Crowley being, Crowley, or was he onto something? It is interesting because what happens there is that Parsons chooses her and Crowley retreats from that relationship with Parsons. So Parsons is kind of hanging out there. And what happens is a lot of weird things go down that end up with him being killed in the blast. So the story goes that he set his explosives too high in his lab and that he accidentally set it off. There's another story that someone misbehavingly, threw a cigarette into his stuff. All of them are kind of flimsy, to be honest with you. For me, there's two things. One, he's run afoul of Howard Hughes and Howard Hughes Aerospace through something. The rumors I've heard about it are ridiculous, but I'll tell you, one of the rumors I've heard is that he had stolen transcripts about what they found at Roswell. So there were other things that he was selling, the things he was developing for Hughes, which is also seems maybe a little more legit. But,
selling them to?
Well, this is interesting. At the end of his life, it comes out that he was under investigation for selling rocket technology to Israel. So now we have a lot of reasons, ways and means of people interfering with what he's doing. What he was actually up to at the end of his life and why he got bumped off, I think, is this is someone who is knowledgeable on the mystery school side and knowledgeable on the technical side, and he ran afoul of some of those powers somewhere. I don't think his death was accidental because he'd been very careful. He knew explosives, and he didn't make those types of mistakes. I mean, it could be as they said it, but the story doesn't hold up very well. I will say this also, that Marjorie didn't believe it at all. And, someone on the inside, you would think so. You would think she'd have that knowledge. This is her painting of Parsons. Check that out.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Oh my.
That's what we're talking about.
Wow.
And don't get me wrong. Sometimes when I think about Parsons and Marjorie, I do a little, bring it right up to 2023. There's a little Grimes, Elon. Talk about aerospace and the moon and the occult. They're all wrapped up, baby, in one big package. All right, 2 more questions and we're done.
Oh my God. I kind of want to get sort of cosmic for a minute.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So Rebel Alliance 77, so few people realize that we are avatars in a larger spiritual war. What does DJ think?
There's no question. Yeah. I mean, it comes down always to macrocosm, microcosm, So on one hand, you think about Jesus. I mean, you've got the Roman Empire, and then you have Jesus, the Avatar. And so, it always comes down to what you do individually and your own realizations. This is, I think, the nature of mystical experience, learning and changing. One of the great things I think Ouspensky added, somebody was coming to him and saying, well, sure, I can do all this work, on myself, but the war is raging around me. Isn't that like, shouldn't I be worried about that? And he said, if you do work on yourself, the conditions around you with the war may change. Meaning your actual circumstances, the reality around you has to do somehow with the level of your awareness. So in a lower level of awareness, you're surrounded by certain types of conditions. But as you up your awareness, the conditions themselves, meaning reality, changes. I think he was saying something very deep there. So I was always caught that and wondered, how would that change? And yet you notice at times when your mental perspective on a thing changes, the reality itself seems to change. And it's not only perception. So there's something deep in that. Absolutely. That's cosmic. Yes.
Okay. I'm going to let you go off on something. Jason T. May, DJ, have you seen John Greenwald with Black Balt on a show recently saying something pertaining to the idea that the JFK UFO connection is absurd and has no proof? Any thoughts?
I mean, watch UFO File Assassins, the X Protect documentary from yours truly. It's all in there. Here's 3 things to go back to Greenwald with. And Greenwald, he can always come on this show if he wants to. 1, the person that the alleged assassin was living with, Lee Harvey Oswald was living with, was Michael Payne's wife. That was Michael Payne's wife, Ruth. That's where Oswald was staying. That's where his wife was staying. And yeah, he got a rooming house later, but So all of the evidence to convict Lee Harvey Oswald came out of Michael Payne, Ruth Payne's household, right? The picture with the rifle and all that stuff. But who's Michael Payne? Two things. One, he is the son of the person who invented the Bell helicopter. But he is the protege of who? He's the protege of Walter Dornberger, who was in charge of the X technology rocket program for the Germans, and who was the boss of von Braun. So the aerospace connection is easy right off the bat. Two, you have two programs, separate programs going on at NASA, which, as we know, Kennedy had a great deal to do with launching and giving a mission, after all. NASA, that is. And what happens there? Well, it's very simple. He, in trying to get control of that and saying, I'm going to smash the CIA, et cetera, he's getting into something very deep on the technology side. He's going into the avenue of a secret technology. So when he demands on November 12th that the CIA of 1963, before he's assassinated, that the CIA give him all their files pertaining to high threat cases because he plans to share them with the Soviets so that there isn't a nuclear incident. He is running afoul of their secrecy program, and they're thinking, the people who are getting this on the paperclip side are thinking, we just killed 25 million Russians. We're not going to share the UFO file with them. And so that sets up dynamics. Now, as everyone who watches this program knows, the Watergate lawyer, Douglas Caddy, came on this program and said what? That his personal friend in private, the CIA super spy, Howard Hunt, famous for Watergate and everything else, said to him that JFK was killed over the UFO file. That's a historical figure putting it on the record. The other thing is that Oswald worked for Guy Bannister. And Bannister was the person who invented the X-Files. He's the guy who basically hunted down all the UFO cases for the FBI when the UFO craze started in 47. Why was Lee Harvey Oswald working for him and saying that his next job was to go to NASA before he ended up moving books around for $1.25 an hour and got set up for the JFK assassination? Everywhere you look, there's a UFO connection to the JFK assassination and to Oswald. And this is interesting because if you look into it, you're going to find that Jim Garrison, in his investigation of the JFK murder, he ran into it. He ran into aerospace and the UFO file over and over again. And he wondered, well, what is this about? Like, why are all these aerospace and UFO connections going on in relation to this? And by the way, he knew Guy Bannister, and he knew him when he was in the FBI. You think maybe he knew, well, this is the guy who investigated UFOs. Why was he training and using Lee Harvey Oswald to infiltrate student groups? And, Lee Harvey Oswald is supposed to be a Marxist. This guy's the ultimate right winger. Why did Kennedy end up dead? Really? What is the nature of the mechanism? Well, certainly the CIA was involved in the murder, but how could they make him into a national security threat? He wanted to share that technology. And that's the nature of the problem. And for me, that's the whole X-Share, X-Protect piece. X-Protect, in that case, moved in to eliminate the X-Share guy and put in another X-Protect guy. Senator NASA, as they used to call Johnson. So, anyone who doesn't have the UFO connection with the Kennedy assassination hasn't been paying attention. You can find it in Farrell's books, too. It's glaring in there. And we've done a number of shows on it. Ken Thomas's work, JFK and UFO. It's there. What's strange is it's overpowering, in fact, when you get around it, way more than anti-Castro Cubans who couldn't penetrate anything, right? They were all under the control of the U.S. government, if anything. There were all kinds of security considerations that they were aware of in relation to Cubans, No, they've been running that type of security, for years. They knew exactly how to handle it. So this is a very unusual case in the assassination of the president and the massive cover up on top of it. And those records show, by the way, the person who they've hidden the records of is George Joannides, who was the intelligence officer who created the Oswald Project, but we weren't even supposed to know that the guy existed. So no one even knew he existed. So he was accidentally unearthed because there was a routing number for who was paying the group that was opposing Oswald. It was like a phony opposition. And they were supposed to be anti-Castro and he was supposed to be pro-Castro. And so they found a payment router. And the payment router, this is the Jefferson Morley investigation, went to this guy who nobody knew anything about. But the thing that I found interesting about Joannides, of course, and it's a kind of a cornerstone of all the X research, is the person who gives him the Career Intelligence Medal is Bobby Inman. Bobby Inman is the former deputy CIA director who talked on the record about the UFO file and talked about, hey, not only do we know about those craft and are we redeveloping them, but we know who's inside. That's Bobby Inman on the record to Timothy Good. So, Bobby Inman's still alive. My recommendation was to put Bobby Inman under oath and ask him, what did you give the Career Intelligence Medal to Joannides for in relation to the Kennedy assassination? And what was the program for UFO secrecy? And he can answer those questions, I think, without incriminating himself in any way. It's not any suggestion that, necessarily that he had anything to do with it, but he was under orders. This is his thing. So he's somebody who could give us some of those answers. There's a lot of ex-players that are still in the game that we can get those answers from. And Henry Kissinger is another one.
Can I ask you a question? I wanted to follow up on Bigelow. How old is Bigelow?
Oh, he's about 70.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how much is he worth?
It's a good question. I think he's worth a couple of $1 billion.
A couple of billion. Okay.
Yeah.
So I know that the space program is more advanced than we are led to believe on Earth, but space hotels seems like it would be at least 20, 30 years. I mean, even under the best circumstances,
Well, he made all his money with hotels.
Right, but I'm just saying he will not be around. One, he doesn't need the money. Two, he won't live that long. I don't know about any heirs. Why is it so urgent for him to invest in space? Legacy?
He got very, I know a lot of things because I know people who've worked for him. So I have a pretty good character profile on Bigelow. He's a very interesting guy. He has a deep interest in the UFO file for sure. He got passed over, I think, and that Elon got elected to be the kind of space president. And I think there are a few companies like Branson and to a lesser degree Blue Origin. They've decided we're going to do this SpaceX thing. And so they've left Branson and Blue Origin and Bigelow at bay. But it's a great question why he owned Skinwalker Ranch, why he had this UFO fascination. He also, on the record, said there are cases of UFO firefights in South America where we didn't come out, like people died. Our soldiers or South American soldiers died. This is interesting because he's never given any details about that. But Bigelow is a pretty big player in all of it. And the fact that he's throwing his money behind DeSantis is pretty wild. And we know that he let out that whole bit about aliens under our nose on 60 Minutes. That's pretty hardcore. But, one of the things that people don't realize about him is that he founded a group that is a company that looks into life after death. I forget the name of the company, but a number of familiar faces work there. And I think we're dealing with a very deep character in Bigelow. And I think his role in the UFO file, this is somebody who's seen it. And probably because of his relationship with Harry Reid, they've given materials to him to assess and be like, get your scientists looking at this, like, what does this do? So I think he's involved in the UFO file. He's in New Mexico. And for me, he's a big player in all of it. So yeah,
Is he in New Mexico or is he in Nevada?
I think his main headquarters may be in Nevada, but his New Mexico is where they do a lot of the aerospace action. Yes.
Oh, we're still going?
No, that's actually a good one to round up on. Fantastic. It's been so great.
Actually, let me end up with this. This is fun.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
So these two. Vase of Flower says, Crowley's libido must have been powered by something that overran the opium. Opioids eviscerate the libido to the point of non-existence. Interesting.
Whose libido?
Crowley's.
Well, the heroin addiction, I think he was addicted to everything, if you think about it.
But the heroin takes over the libido.
Well, he wrote Diary of a Dope Fiend. I would probably get some answers there. But yeah, it is weird, though, because you look at that 60s culture and it feels like all the people going over the top with heroin and everything. Really? I mean, isn't it like they all become some version of Crowley? It's strange. All the hard cases. Yeah.
Tombaged. Crowley probably also went a tad bit far to the Luciferian side with drugs and chaos, sex magic, etc.
Oh, yeah.
This actually made me wonder, I
think that's a yes.
A tad bit. Is there any amount of Luciferian chaos, sex magic that's okay? That is positive?
Oh, I think there's a, Dionysian questing for a vision kind of thing that exists in a lot of different cultures. There's the whole peyote cults as well. So I think under certain types of conditions, they do those things and they know how to make them beneficial. But one of the things that came out of the Gurdjieff work I think is interesting, which is they said that the schools that he was a part of said drugs could give no permanent results, except maybe permanent brain damage. But it is interesting. In terms of spiritual development, you can't take something and then have that be the development. The development happens in you. So if what you're after is spiritual development, then drugs wouldn't be the doorway to do it, because, those can be interesting experiences, perhaps. I don't recommend them because I value penetrating into reality. And I think you can do it without, any drug at all. But I would say anything along that line, or anything you hear about, ayahuasca and all these different things, I think the whole idea is under very contained circumstances, that those cultures have it. And I'm not sure that that's something that they can transfer over to Western cultures. You hear about this Amazon shaman trade and things like that. I don't know enough about it to really say, but my feeling on it is pretty straight ahead, which is, I'm telling you, drugs are not the pathway in terms of self-discovery, and I think you learn that either, during the process or after, but it's better if you don't learn it at all, because you're better off without it. And there's a lot in reality to penetrate into that has a visionary nature and a visionary quality that doesn't require any drugs.
Okay, yes. I think this is these are the questions to end on. So Bobo the Clown, how does Dr. Stephen Greer fit into this serious, possible CIA cult group? And Robert Ayala says, Dr. Stephen Greer is releasing on the 6th the conference and evidence of man-made UFOs in conjunction with the documentary The Lost Century. What is DJ's opinion?
Well, I think the idea, the title, The Lost Century, is interesting, because don't you look around sometimes and think, with all the technology we have and things, there's a lot of incredibly clunky technology going on, and we could have been a lot more advanced. Things could have been on, we could have had things like super trains. We could have had alternative energy. Things could have been a whole lot different. And instead, that stuff was held back And those corporate forces, X-Protect, the military forces, they held back those advances from humanity. And so we've been living under assumed reality, where somebody else was in charge of that. Healthcare goes deep into that. Well, look what they'll do with healthcare. Look what we just came through with the COVID op. They'll do anything for their own advantage, and they'll exploit humanity for that advantage, and they'll use excuses to themselves in the background, like, well, we need lower population anyway. Instead of having, if that were the case, they should have had that open conversation, say, with the public in the 1980s and said, the population's too large for the resources that we have. Now, I don't subscribe to that, but if that was the case, then that would have been the way to handle it. Instead, they go through this weird, devious process, control the media, zombify everybody, and then line them up for experimental ops. That's no way to run a culture. Where does that lead to? Would you do that to your own family? No. So, the leadership equation, we have an upside down leadership thing going on. Part of the opening, I think, in relation to understanding history, understanding NASA, even understanding the JFK assassination, there's still information that's coming out. The Nix film, the feds are still giving the Nix family a problem. The Nix family had to take the feds to court because they have their own version of the film, their own Zapruder film. And there's always been a weird knockoff, cheap copy of it available. But, historians have said, well, if a real version of it were available, that's still, is like the first version, the original copy, it would actually reveal a lot more. So, but the feds have never given it back. So now the Nix family, is suing the government for something like $50 million to give it back. So they may have to give it back. But these things are all parts of the equation of awakening from the dream that they've put us under. And the UFO file is right in the middle of that. And I think the realization around the advanced technology in the UFO file and its relation to the 2024 election is going to be a big one for us. So that's, I think, very worthwhile in terms of going after. That's the story we're going to get. And I'm still telling those good, the people on the good side, whether it's the Trump campaign or the RFK Jr. campaign, get in on the UFO file, because they're gonna be releasing something. And we keep hearing these things in the background. Get ahead of them and demand a transparency policy on it. Yes.
Okay.
That'll do it.
Amelia
Yep.
Dedanen. What is the likelihood of some of that same style of magic going on at CERN?
Is that like Tuatha De Danann? I'm sure CERN is a occult center, par excellence, as we've done. And there's new things about CERN which we're going to bring up. So, I would certainly say, I've shown these cards at times, but that is the famous CERN tarot. I think those people have a cult hankering to them. Could well be. Yeah. And also all those strange phony rituals going on there. But I think that we're on the cusp of a great realization. So we're really moving into that. And with that, Miss Olivia,
okay,
you're up.
Great. I have a lot of super chatters to thank.
Fantastic.
Mark Lane, Dawn Newway, Gillenjoy R, Terry Doherty, Just a Girl, Catherine Rorden, Boba the Clown, Anunnaki, The Drunken Scoundrel, Ivan Langley, Brian Berner, Norman Smith, Elizabeth, EchoCat 23, Medley Childress, PJ Doe, Wolfgang McCarthy, Neurosurgery Highland, Jonathan McIntosh, Slow Time, John Folden, the Philip K. Dick Film Festival, Wait a Minute 72, Bob Bindert, Kat Carroll, Catherine Farrell, Shelby C., Thomas Ball, Fulcanelli, Doreen Hewitt, Eurythmia's Fun, Lou Dontole, W.C. Ray, and Harvardian. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Wow, we really appreciate it. And it helps us to keep the work going that we're doing here. We'll be back with you next week. And I want to say to all our subscribers, thank you, because we couldn't do what we do without you. We'll be back here next week with X Series episode 151. And we have some important interviews coming up for you in the next week or two as well. So stay tuned, as it were, and make sure.
If Greer's documentary comes out, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about the quality on it. I mean,
but we'll have to report on it.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it goes. I don't know much about it, but I will say that it's, let's hope that there's more important things coming out in relation to all this. We have some exciting RFK Jr. Presidential events coming up. Trump was just in a town hall last night, skimming through that. Some interesting things said there. The idea of getting us out of the Ukraine war, very important. The advent of advanced technology being exercised in these situations is also very dangerous. So we need to keep our eyes on that. We will see you all next week. Before we go, a couple of shout outs to you. I like this. That DJ is a smart guy. I like that. Thank you, Elizabeth. It's great to have the ideas room out there, let me tell you. Fantastic. Salt of the Earth. We love having you here, Salt of the Earth. Thank you for being here. Shane Walker. Good night, Joseph. There we go. Zapruder was an obster. Hey, that's clever. Najad, way to go. Eurythmia is fun. Thank you. Incredible support for the show and everything we do here. We very much appreciate it. And let's see what else we got. Jimmy Lyle, Huma John, Robin Sullivan. Gigi's out there. Thank you, Gigi. Outstanding work. Check out Gigi's latest. Just takes you deep into the cosmic canyon. Incredible work Gigi's been doing. And she's going to be back on the show shortly, maybe within like the next week, if things go well. Joseph's out there. Thank you, Joseph. We're talking about IGY. We're going to have that conversation soon. David Tormina. Thank you very much, sir. Bobo, Alchemy by Angels, Fulcanelli. See organic versus inorganic beings. Yeah, absolutely. Isn't that interesting? And I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Thomas Ball, Karen Carpenter. Excellent. Wow, great crowd. Queen of the Juice. Salt of the Earth. Al Qaeda. Awesome recent video. I agree. Couldn't agree more. We will see you all next week. And, it says end broadcast after all, but it never really ends. And we want you all to have a great night. Miss Olivia? Bravo. Nicely done. Go ahead.
Happy full moon.
Oh, that's what it is. Yeah.
I think it's called a strawberry moon.
Yes.
Don't know what that means yet.
Whoa. That's interesting. I think the full moon just went off.
Wow.
They're doing something. Thank you, everyone. There's some wild, that could be Crowley coming back.
Oh my God.
What is that? I have no idea what that is, but it sounds like it's coming through the wall. We will see you all next week, everyone. Thank you. God bless, and have a great weekend. And we'll see you next week.
Yep. God bless everybody.
All right. End broadcast. Never let it be forgotten.